Kissinger attended a private party a few months later at the Manhattan apartment of Claire Booth Luce, recently widowed by the death of Time Life publisher Henry Luce. Miss Luce didn't recognize Mystery Men. It was her coming out party, a woman friend recalls. Someone suggested inviting Kissinger, and Claire said, "I don't know him, I think not." But then she decided, yes, I do need bachelors. So Henry was in the last batch of invitations sent out. And guess who was the first to RSVP? There were many guests at the party. One was prosperous New York lawyer by the way of California, Richard M. Nixon, who had once run for president and intended to run again. His major opponent in the 1968 Republican primaries was expected to be Nelson Rockefeller, who was not at the party, but Claire Booth Luce thought it would be interesting to introduce Nixon to a Rockefeller man. So she introduced Nixon to Kissinger, and she wasn't wrong. They began to chat, said a woman who was there. I remember seeing them off in the corner, talking alone, for a long time. Hello everyone, today I'm going to be reading excerpts from the book Henry Kissinger, The Private and Public Story by Ralph Blumenfeld and the staff and editors of the New York Post, copyright 1974. Why am I reading the excerpts? Well, these are the most memorable parts of the book, the things I took away with me after reading this book. If you listen to this video, it will be somewhat like you read the book. This book is almost entirely made up of quotes from many different people who knew Henry Kissinger, a lot of them friends, and a lot of them ardent enemies of Kissinger. In that regard, this book was very insightful into the zeitgeist of the 70s. You get a good feel of public opinion, especially of public opinion about Henry Kissinger in the 70s. There's also a lot of references to foreign conflicts that have been obscured by the passage of time. Like, I had no idea the U.S. and the Nixon administration were to blame for supporting a genocide in Bangladesh. But in the book, they talk about it like recent news. I had no idea that the U.S. had a massive airlift to provide Israel with ammunition to the Yom Kippur War. But again, in the book, it's recent news. I personally was hoping for more of an analysis on Henry Kissinger's foreign policy. I can't say that I have a solid understanding of it from this particular book, although that kind of undertaking would be very difficult to gather. Kissinger wrote a bunch of books that are, 800 pages each? Plus you need to read up on Castlereagh and Bismarck and Metternich to understand them. And then you need an account of what really happened inside closed doors in the Pentagon. What a mess, especially since so many of the players are dead. Now, having said that, this book had many insights into what happened inside closed doors. I guess what I'm saying is, it wasn't a thorough look into that stuff, since that's not what this book is supposed to be. This is a biography, and as such, it had a lot of insights into different facets of Henry Kissinger's life. This book answered, I think, a couple questions that I had about Kissinger. Why are we still talking about Kissinger, even today? Why has he gone down in history as the archetype of the role of Secretary of State? He's like the stereotypical Secretary of State. Why? And the second question is, how could I raise a kid who will someday be Secretary of State? In terms of the first question, why is Kissinger the exemplar sort of archetype of the role of Secretary of State? The answer is, he was good at marketing. Or as someone in the book put it, Kissinger knew how to play the media. He had the cerebral old man look, but there was a rumor going around that he was a swinger. By the way, he wasn't a swinger, but he never denied it. The origin of that rumor is detailed in the book, and I talk about it in one of the excerpts. A reporter brought it up, and he just didn't deny it, and he encouraged the rumor. And that was that. He also, after getting divorced, would date a different starlet every week. According to a couple of the sources in the book, it was completely platonic. But it got the press talking about him and about his sexual conquests. I would imagine being mocked in that Dr. Strangelove movie also may have helped. Although I've heard some people say that he was not the inspiration for that character, and other people say that he was, so I don't know which is true. But the country's had many Secretary of States come and go, and a lot of them, or maybe all of them, have been very consequential. But why do we still think highly of Kissinger? Was it the Nobel Peace Prize? Was it China? Was it the Yom Kippur War? I don't know for sure. Even after reading this book, I can't say with confidence. But if you know, please comment. The second question is, how could I raise a kid who will someday be Secretary of State? This is a thing I often wonder. If two children are born, one raised in poverty and one raised in an affluent household, how is it possible for the poor child to one day rule the world? Now, this happens all the time, by the way. Henry Kissinger is one example of this. When I read the book, The Young Hitler I Knew, about Adolf Hitler's childhood, the answer was clear. You see, in Hitler's case, Hitler had been preparing for the role of chancellor every single minute of his life. He rose to power, remember, in part because of his eloquent oration, right? Well, he practiced giving speeches every single day. If he went to and saw the opera, he would make an emotional speech about it every day, about basically everything. Hitler also thought about how he would help the poor every single day. Don't get me wrong, Hitler was undoubtedly an evil guy, and he ruined not only Germany, but the world. However, he asked himself how he would improve Germany every single day. He would make sketches of how to rebuild buildings. He'd sketch how to build bridges to solve congestion. He'd plan how to make a mobile orchestra to bring music to the poor. He was always doing a project in his mind, and that was preparing him on how to rule Germany. I explain what I mean by all of this more on the video that I will make about that book. Now, in the case of Henry Kissinger, how did he rise out of poverty and become one of the most powerful men in the world? Well, during Kissinger's time in Harvard as a college student, he read, and he read, and he read. He locked himself in his room for the full duration of his college years, just reading. That is how he stood out from others. Besides that, he learned to network. The Harvard International Seminar absolutely catapulted him. Kissinger's friendship with Nelson Rockefeller also opened many doors for Kissinger. So he not only had the knowledge, but he also knew how to use networking. Now, if you Google Kissinger, you end up with the Kissinger was a war criminal crap from Christopher Hitchens. I haven't read that book. I saw the documentary that accompanies the book, and the documentary did a lot of cherry picking, in my opinion. It was not a good documentary. Now, again, I haven't read the book, so I shouldn't judge the book based on the documentary. That hasn't happened yet. I want to defend Henry Kissinger, and I was kind of hoping this book would give me a step up. It's all one of the things is it's a lot of conjecture. It's everyone's opinion. So you get a great sense of people's opinion on Henry Kissinger. I don't know how many opinions were based on facts or which ones. I'm sure a lot of them were. They were first-hand sources, but you just wonder which ones are backed by facts. Anyways, having said all of that, this book was really an enjoyable book. It was fun. It was a fun book. Kissinger was an exceptional man, and all the little infighting and people throwing cracks at him and all the crazy things, all the things that have changed. It's fun. It was a fun book. Now, before I begin to read the excerpts of the book, I want to give a shout out to The Book Thing in Baltimore. This is not a commercial. It's just that I got this particular book about Henry Kissinger from a bookstore in Baltimore called The Book Thing. The special thing about this particular bookstore is that all the books are completely free. You just walk in, pick out as many books as you want, and then leave with them. It is strictly prohibited to pay for the books you got there. And that's where I got this book about Henry Kissinger from. So if you're ever in Baltimore, in dangerous, crack-infested downtown Baltimore, put on a bulletproof vest, but make sure to head over to The Book Thing. I'm not even joking. It's a really cool bookstore. So Henry Kissinger was born a Jew in Germany, and to contextualize some of the violence that was happening to Jewish kids back then, the author added a number of testimonials from Jewish kids. The one that really got to me was by Paul Stiefel from Chicago. He said, "They'd put us before a class to show what a Jew looked like, and during gym lessons, they'd make Frank Harris and I lie spread eagle on the floor and roll their knees across the muscles of our arms. It was very painful." That's an excerpt from page 25. Page 27. An American who worked for Henry Kissinger in Washington says he once asked Kissinger why the Jews went so quietly to the gas chambers. Kissinger said, "In the rest of Europe, I don't know, but in Germany it was simple. They were Germans. When they were told to report on a certain day, if their name started with a certain letter, they were there on the hour." Page 31. Kissinger also played the game of soccer, or tried to, his friends say. He was not a great success. Page 32. Henry was self-conscious at 13 about not being particularly handsome or built attractive to women. He'd make an attempt to flirt with a girl and shy back, make an attempt and shy back. He was friendly with two studious girls, Edith Murr and Lottie Bauer, but only intellectually, Stifel said. I do recall that he wanted to be equal to the rest of us, but he lacked finesse. I'm convinced to this day that Henry's not a woman's man, but he's an opportunist, and he's in a position of advantage now. Page 33. It seems to me he had a problem with his father. If I'm not mistaken, he was afraid of him because he was a very pedantic man. His father was always checking Heinz's, so that's Kissinger's friend's homework, and kept a close watch on him. Page 43. We were prepared to die in the war, either by war action or as a result of the war. Henry Gitterman says, "We thought we would lose the war because we remember times in Germany when we couldn't cross the street for 6 days. There were so many tanks rolling by. Not until I got to the Philippines as an infantryman, where I could see the U.S. fleet arrayed as far as the eye could see, could I believe that we could win the war." Page 46. Henry Kissinger, his CCNY and high school grades had been impressively high, so the Army's next routine move was to send Kissinger back to the classroom. At Clemson College near Camp Croft that July, he took a battery of IQ and aptitude tests that qualified him for the Army Special Training Program. It was like putting a shark in a goldfish tank. The ASTP was a controversial program devised for two purposes: to help repopulate some of the nation's colleges emptied by the draft, and to train qualified GIs for duties that required an education ranging from dentistry to engineering. At its peak in 1944, the Army program had 140,000 troops hitting the books instead of beaches. They were expected to help run the occupied countries after the war was won. Page 51. In March of 1944, after Kissinger had completed 12 engineering courses and received 12 A's, the U.S. War Department bowed to pressure and abruptly terminated the ASTP project. Page 57. They moved out again on September 29 on a substitute transport, the Stirling Castle, a British vessel that once ran mail to India. And this time they had an uneventful 13-day Atlantic crossing, complicated only by malnutrition. The ship's cooks were English, and only the bread was edible, but Kissinger may not have noticed. I don't know how true that story is, but it's obviously, talking about how British food is known to taste bad. I just found it interesting. Page 59. In his State Department office last March 23rd, Secretary Kissinger was asked what his feelings might have been when he returned to Nazi Germany as an American soldier. Exultation? Vengeance? Not vengeance, Kissinger said. I felt to the dismay of my family that if racial discrimination was a vis-a-vis the Jews, it was a vis-a-vis the Germans. I mean, you couldn't blame a whole people. Page 63. Kramer, Kissinger's sergeant, Kramer, privately referred to Kissinger as "my little Jew." So to sort of recap the story so far, Henry Kissinger was Jewish. He was born in Germany. They emigrated out of Germany, and then he came back as a soldier to Germany. He was put in this special program because he was so smart, and the program had this idea of training people to rebuild the occupied countries. Also, page 63. Private Kissinger was made military administrator of Krefeld in mid-March with orders to get the city functioning. It was a crisis situation and an opportunity. This young soldier, Kramer marvels, reconstructed the city government in 5-6 days. There was nothing. No telephone, no food, nothing. Kramer thought it was a bravura performance, duplicated all over Germany later by other agents, to be sure, but they were usually older men. Kissinger was totally inexperienced, and only 21. How did he do it? Page 65. The CIC's major task was to provide security against Nazi spies and saboteurs who lingered in the battle area. These Germans had to be identified and arrested, not only local Nazi civilians but Gestapo agents and SS officers masquerading as non-political Wehrmacht troops among the war prisoners. The civilians were easy, Mudari said, especially in the smaller towns. The ones who looked well-fed and were well-dressed after years of wartime privations figured to be Nazis. Kissinger excelled at questioning civilians, Mudari said. Using hackneyed tricks out of the basic police manual, he would outwit his former countrymen and catch some of them off guard. He would assure each suspect, "We know you're not important, you're just a small fry," until the suspect's pride was piqued and he would bark, "I'm an Obergruppenführer." It was a common psychological technique in the CIC. Page 66. Kissinger won a Bronze Star for one high-risk mission in April 1945, near the war's end, when he slipped through the enemy lines in CVs to question retreating troops about the probabilities of the German High Command ordering a counterattack. It was a hazardous work, posing as a North German burgher with a South German accent, but the information Kissinger brought back was valuable enough to headquarters to warrant a medal. Kramer, irreverent as ever, poo-poos Bronze Stars or any medals based on a rear echelon judgment. He got one himself after winning a battlefield commission, and to this day, Kramer said, he has no idea what it was for. If you were a true hero, you'd probably be overlooked, he said. If you were an officer, you'd have to steal spoons not to get it. Page 66 also. Ralph Ferris says that despite the photographs of Russian and American GIs toasting each other at the Elbe in the last days of the Third Reich, all the CIC agents remained deep-eyed anti-Soviets. We had been trained in the States, he explained, and much of the training stressed containment of communism infiltration in post-war Germany. Page 67. They had discussed U.S. domestic politics on occasion, Ferris said, and Henry was generally speaking in favor of the New Deal reforms which Ferris, as an old Maine conservative, largely opposed, but he recalls that both were opposed to Roosevelt's demand for unconditional surrender by the Germans. Without that requirement, he said, they felt we could have terminated the war much sooner, and the Russians would not have gone as far as they did, because the Germans wanted to surrender to the Americans, not the Russians. It was a condition the dying FDR refused to accept. Page 69. Kissinger's whole search has been to impose a stable order, a moderate order, which would not humiliate anybody. Kissinger, more than most, would probably agree with Gorter's statement that disorder is worse than injustice. Also page 69. Roger Morris of Kissinger's First National Security Council staff says Kissinger saw the surging U.S. demonstrations against the Vietnam War as analogous to the riots on both left and right in pre-Hitler Germany. It continues. Long before the Watergate scandal, Kissinger told another former NSC aide, "We've let the people in the streets drive one president from office, Lyndon Johnson, and if it happens again, it could be the end of this nation as we understand it." Page 70. Sergeant Kissinger's counterintelligence duties included the questioning of Nazism's most damaged survivors, the thousands of sickly, emaciated, confused men and women and children streaming out of the concentration camps. They were victims of injustice and disorder. Page 72. Mr. Henry needed a suitable place to live. Of course, in the manner of Allied unit commanders all over Germany, he simply evicted the owners of the most luxurious dwelling in sight and moved his duffel bag in. Page 73. Kissinger's guest to that inn was the widow, a blonde. She dazzled Jerry Brockhofer, who visited the villa after Kissinger sent 2 agents to 7th Army headquarters to invite him. "What a setup," Brockhofer wrote in his diary on October 21st, 1945. "Like a castle. Had dinner with him. What an intelligent girlfriend." It is still vivid in Brockhofer's in 1974. "He gave a terrific party, a fabulous feast," he said. "I remember how beautiful his girlfriend was. It was totally in character with the way Henry is today. He really enjoyed the trappings of authority." Page 74. It was common practice, one said, for soldiers assigned to administer a town to pick out the best houses and the best women. It's not an exception, it's the rule. Page 75. Kissinger's favorite Nazi story is about how he put up posters in Bensheim advertising for men with police experience, another standard CIC ploy, and about what happened when the first of many Gestapo applicants showed up. I asked him what he had been doing, the Secretary of State told us, and he said, "Staatspolizei." I then asked him in a joking manner, "Geheim Staatspolizei?" And he said yes, so I locked him up. The acronym, of course, is Gestapo. He volunteered to prove his good faith, and I told him to find his colleagues. He found them. I looked up more Gestapo than the entire rest of the U.S. Army, Kissinger said. Now we're on chapter The Scholar, page 83. At Harvard, in any case, Kissinger had no time to be dapper. He wasn't trying to impress the Radcliffe girls. Some thought he was a sublimator, as Bauman put it. Here we were chasing girls, and here he was reading. What kind of men do that? Either homosexuals or sublimators. Underdeveloped guys lacking in self-confidence. They sat home and studied. But Kissinger had a girl, Anne Fleischer, back in New York. Page 84. About women, Henry was generally reticent. He never bragged about his sexual conquests in Europe unless egged into it. We tried to get him to, Bauman said. We asked what was it like, but we couldn't get him to tell us. He was not a giving person, even on an information level. Instead, Henry would conceptualize about the phenomenon of power in an occupied country like Germany. He told complicated stories about how he would get the women who wanted to ingratiate themselves to those in authority, Bauman said. He always talked in manipulative terms. He was the man with the gun, the jeep, the coffee, stockings, chocolates. Those were important things. Also on page 85, he was a German who had come to America and expected the Germans to win World War II. He was an American, and many Americans in the late 40s were expecting to fight the Russians in World War III. Page 86. Top grades were required merely to get a graduate student as tutor. Outstanding grades merited a junior faculty tutor. Only the best got a senior advisor tutor, as Kissinger did. He landed with the one man who eventually would have perhaps a greater impact on his life than anyone else. He was the controversial Professor William Yandell Elliott, then High Priest of Harvard's Government Department. Page 87. Elliott is 78 now, in retirement in Haywood, Virginia. He has had 2 strokes since 1970, but he taught J.F. Kennedy and tutored Pierre Trudeau, McGeorge Bundy, and Henry Kissinger. They've asked me how he could pick these winners, said Elliott's wife, Louise. It seems to me he was open to anyone who was able to follow him. He was always able to lead them forward, and if they could go, they stuck. If they couldn't go, they didn't stick. Page 88. What did Elliott see in Henry Kissinger in 1948? Well, you've got to understand that he was a man who had missed his turn in the road, Kissinger said. He was a man of great ability who could have done anything, but I think he considered me a man of philosophic depth. A Harvard colleague suggests why Elliott missed the turn that Kissinger took, the road to power. Intellectually, Henry was much more solid than Elliott, he said. The older man must have sensed this, and to his credit, he never resented Henry. He did all he could for him. So far, the biography has mentioned 2 of his mentors, Kissinger's mentors, Kramer and Elliott in Harvard. Right? Kramer was his sergeant who used to call him my little Jew and whatnot. Anyways, on page 89, it says, some who have been close to Kissinger believe Kramer was the most important man in Henry's life. Fritz pushed him, said Leonore Reich, and of course without Kramer, there would be no Elliott. Page 89. Bauman thought Anne, remember Anne Fleischer, Henry Kissinger's girlfriend in Harvard and his first wife? So Bauman thought Anne seemed demure, like a frightened doe, and remarked how undemonstrative they were. There was not the usual give and take between people. They didn't respond or comment on what each other said. They never touched. She seemed like an appurtenance. Page 91. One of Kissinger's 1950 opinions, however, created a heated government department controversy. It was Kissinger's theory that modern philosophers Oswald Spengler and Arnold Toynbee could be considered in a comparative class with the sainted Immanuel Kant. The deep pessimism of Spengler's Decline of the West in particular appealed to Kissinger. He walked in a way with the ghost of Spengler at his side, said his friend Professor Stanley Hoffman. Things got hotter when Henry decided to treat the threesome as a unit in his senior honor thesis, The Meaning of History, and all hell broke loose when he elected to let the thesis run on for 377 pages, still an all-time Harvard record, in order to get it all said. Now into the chapter The Seminar, page 92. So Kissinger embarked on a postgraduate study of conservative statesmen Count Metternich of Austria and Lord Castlereagh of Great Britain, who were credited by some historians with having maintained peace in Europe for most of the 19th century. I think I highlighted that just to remind myself to look them up and learn more about that deal. Page 64. There is no record of whose idea it was, Eliot's or Kissinger's, but Herbert Spiro remembers how Henry set out to organize the project. He did something that no one at Harvard, in my experience, had ever done. He went around and talked to everyone, people like myself, to sort of solicit ideas, or seem to solicit ideas, which was very clever because it made people sympathetic to the project instead of making them suspicious of somebody who appeared to be building an empire for himself. To the Harvard hierarchy, the International Seminar was just another interesting summer program that would either sink or swim, said Benjamin Brown, its assistant director in the 60s. But from the outset, it prospered beyond all expectations, ultimately attracting more than 600 participants from around the world. The seminar was a fixture at Harvard until Kissinger left to join Nixon in 1969. To Eliot, the major purpose of the seminar was to counteract Soviet propaganda about the evils of imperial America. It continues on the same page. There was a definite accent on youth. Few persons over 40 were invited, on the theory that if they had not made their mark by 40, they weren't going to make it. For those who did qualify, the international seminar amounted to a free vacation in July and August. Page 96. One 1954 seminar participant was a 28-year-old official in the French finance ministry, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, a rising star even then. But who could have foreseen that in 20 years Giscard would be elected president of France? In 1953, there was Japan's future Minister of Trade, Yasuhiro Nakasone. In 1957, Yigal Allon, a member of the Israeli Knesset, later to be deputy premier. In 1958, Congo's future ambassador to the United Nations, Thomas Arkanza. In 1962, Erhard Epler, the future West German Minister for Economic Cooperation, and Leo Tindemans, who would become Belgium's prime minister. In 1968, Norway's future foreign minister, Knut Frydenlund. Page 98. He would bring in a Democrat, a Republican, a Goldwater boy, a Walt Rostow, a John Kenneth Galbraith. He didn't try to convince us of any point of view. He didn't make propaganda for the Republicans or Democrats, but propaganda for the American system in general. Yes, that was a different thing. Page 99. Walter Beulich cites his beloved examples, Metternich and Otto von Bismarck, the 19th century Chancellor of Germany, both extremely reactionary and both on the surface extremely successful, but in the long run disastrous, considering the development of Europe. They stopped all progressive activities, all reform. Bismarck stopped the development of socialism. Page 100. If he is truly intelligent, he will know that nearly nothing depends on personalities but on political facts, constellations, dynamics. Now, as the great Vermittler, middleman, Kissinger's possibility is not to promote peace, but only to allow the kind of peace which won't hurt American industry. His merit is that he presumes to be the actor in a comedy which is already written. He didn't write it. The text is already set down. Page 101. What is fascinating is that he is of Jewish origin, and this does not irritate the Arabs. I don't mean by that Arabs are anti-Semitic, not at all, but they know the extremely strong relations that exist between American Jews and Israel. Emphasis on Kissinger being Jewish is more an American problem than a matter of substance. That is not to say that such prejudice or concern doesn't exist here in Germany too. It could never happen in a million years that an American Jew could become a German and become foreign minister. It continues in page 101. At the seminar, Beulich and other German participants noticed that Kissinger seemed reluctant to speak German. That was his private affair, Beulich said. But he never said, "You bloody Germans have murdered 6 million Jews. My mother is Jewish, so was another fellow there." Kissinger knew that we had Jewish mothers. He never did mention his childhood experiences. I could think there are at least 2 motives for him to suppress such thoughts. First one, he decided to be a real American. And second, it is easier to forget. He had other problems in the United States. In page 102, they have a quote from Siegfried Unseld, now head of West Germany's Surkamp Verlag publishing house. He was a 1955 participant in the Harvard International Seminar. And he says, An astonishing thing to me is that Kissinger describes Nixon as the most intelligent president in the last years. Kissinger says the president has an enormous capacity to listen and to functionalize what he hears. Page 106. The funding of the seminar came chiefly from the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller-backed Asia Foundation, and the private individuals. Groups like the Friends of the Middle East reportedly used cash contributions to exert strong influence over the choice of seminarians from certain countries. In 1967, the Friends of the Middle East was identified as one of the CIA's conduits that had funneled a total of $243,000 to the Harvard International Seminar since 1953. Page 107. But by the time Kissinger got his PhD in 1954, his future at Harvard was clouded. In addition to some faculty jealousy over the success of the seminar and resentment of Kissinger's closeness to Eliot, there was hostility towards his choice of doctoral subjects. Graubart says Kissinger chose Metternich and Klasserow because they created a peace that lasted for a century, and now the world needed a formula for peace. Friedrich observes that these Austrian and British statesmen aristocrats were not very much liked figures in academia, and suggests that the unfavorable reaction only enforced Henry in his studies. Like Luther, he has a streak of German stubbornness. Now we're on to Chapter 9, The Dream Match. Page 109. In 1955, Rockefeller was Eisenhower's special assistant for international affairs. Not quite the same role in those days as now, Rockefeller said. For one thing, he was distinctly outranked by a former Rockefeller lawyer, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. Rockefeller thought he'd one-up Dulles before the Geneva Summit Conference that July. He wanted to submit to Eisenhower some sort of fresh approach to the nagging threat of nuclear war, a new package for Ike to take to Geneva. Rockefeller needed suggestions. A group of academics was convened at Quantico in early June, and the fresh approach that Rockefeller sought turned out to be the open skies concept of aerial inspection and mutual exchange of information between the United States and Soviet Russia. Henry was an important part in developing this, Rockefeller said. I went to President Eisenhower, and he was excited, and he picked up the phone, which was a mistake, and called Foster Dulles and said, Foster, Nelson's here, and he's got a great idea. Of course, that killed it right there. Dulles was frostily opposed. Rockefeller recalled that Eisenhower did in fact offer the open skies concept at Geneva over Dulles' objections, but the Russians opposed to it too, and 2 years later, when they launched Sputnik, the first Earth satellite, that was all the aerial inspection Moscow wanted. Page 112. Nobody saw what was coming in 1955 any more than anyone had foreseen it in 1935 in Forth. What they saw was a hard-driving man of many facets, some likable, some not. George Franklin's wife, Helena, had immediate reason to appreciate Kissinger when he and Anne first came to lunch at the Franklin's country home in Oyster Bay on Long Island's North Shore. About 10 minutes before their arrival, our dog was run over, and I was too upset even to greet them, Miss Franklin said. But when I came down later, Henry came up to me with tears in his eyes and said, I know just how you feel. I was very touched. Kissinger's empathy led to a lasting friendship with the Franklins. During the Vietnam War, they were passing through Washington with their daughter Cynthia, 17, and Kissinger took the family to dinner. Cynthia was opposed to the war and couldn't resist the opportunity to argue the subject with the White House advisor, recalls Franklin. I said, now, Cindy, I think Henry's had enough about the Vietnam War for the last few weeks. Let's give him a rest for a while. But Henry said, no, that's okay. Many young people, I know what they're going to say. They're very stereotyped, but what she's saying is very interesting. She's making some good points. This time, he barely remembered to wrap the compliment around the insult. Which, by the way, Kissinger, the book says that Kissinger was known for having passive-aggressive compliments. Anyways, it goes on. Cindy was very forceful, her father said, and pulled no punches. And Kissinger continued the discussion for 20 minutes. Did he assure her that Vietnam was not a moral issue? Neither parent recalls the substance of the discussion, but her mother thought it was an honest exchange, and that Cindy was impressed by Kissinger's willingness to talk it out. She'd been on a lot of anti-war marches, but after that, she became very devoted to Henry, Miss Franklin said. She said the episode showed Kissinger as more faceted than people think. Page 118. He was enormously sensitive, often had hurt feelings, Rubenhausen said. He suffered a great deal by taking things personally, simple things like whether a car met him at the airport and whether it was a Cadillac or not. He would weep on one shoulder at some little slight. It was candor and Byzantine, Machiavellian scheming at the same time. The book mentions a lot how he would cry on the shoulders of his secretaries, but he would also really verbally abuse his secretaries. Page 101. One of his students, Stephen R. Rifkin, now a lawyer in Washington, was then in his last year at Harvard. I was trying to decide whether to go on and get a PhD or to go to law school, Rifkin said, and I went to Kissinger and said, what do you think? He told me, get out and get yourself a profession that will have real meaning to you. Don't become like me. We're on to Chapter 10, The Professor, which talks about how he was a professor at Harvard. Page 122. Some early students found Kissinger's course provocative enough, but overshadowed by lectures of Harvard's foreign affairs superstar, McGeorge Bundy, who would later become National Security Advisor to President John F. Kennedy. 124. Campuses in the late 50s were more tranquil than they became after the Vietnam War flared up in the mid-60s. Only one issue evoked a mass student protest in Alcott's time, and that was the disarmament issue. He remembers a one-day protest against U.S. nuclear testing when students wore blue armbands demanding unilateral disarmament. Kissinger advocated negotiated disarmament instead. I can remember Kissinger coming into class and he started off by saying, "I disagree with my friends wearing the blue armbands," Alcott said. He insisted that it could only be achieved through negotiation and that it had to be recognized that every country would act in its self-interest and that only negotiation could lead to an agreement based on each country's self-interest. Negotiation, he stressed it over and over. Today, Alcott agrees with Kissinger that the unilateral approach to any such question would be romantic, sentimental, and dangerous. It continues on page 124. John Groats, a boyhood friend of Alcott in Westport, Connecticut, was one of his roommates at Harvard, but he was not a Kissinger fan. "Detente is so ironic," said Groats. "Kissinger used to tell us that any understanding between nations was a hoax. He said the trouble with Hitler's Germany and Chamberlain's England was that they understood each other too much." The word understand in this context apparently was meant to be ironic, as fatuous as a parent's understanding of a wayward child. Gross said that Kissinger criticized Eleanor Roosevelt's view that everyone should understand each other. Page 125. But the two roommates' perception of Kissinger, the professor, were often as markedly different as his own roommate's perception of Kissinger as student. Unlike Gross' example, Alcott considered detente a natural outgrowth of Kissinger's containment theories. "To me it follows like night and day," Alcott said, because of Kissinger's notion of trying to prevent war between two superpowers by very slow and careful steps of accommodations within the framework of their own interests, compared to Barry Goldwater's polarization approach of wiping a country off the face of the earth. Page 126. "I think the really big difference was that you could confront him," she said. "Kissinger tried to leave time at the end of the lecture for questions, and he would accept a challenge, usually with wit. Many challenges came from the African students. I remember at one point he called them the underdeveloped nations, and an African student stood up and said, 'We prefer to be called the emergent nations.' He laughed and joked about it, and after that he called them the emergent nations. The only time she saw Kissinger get mad, she said, was during one of the endless nuclear test ban debates in class. One student really confronted him, and Kissinger said, 'You may not agree with what I think, but you better agree with me on June 17th, which was the date of the final exam.' She regarded it a momentary loss of temper. Another Radcliffe graduate recalls that Kissinger was noted for a very hard reading list. Professor Elliott had once given Kissinger a reading list of 25 books. Kissinger required his students to plow through a list of 16 pages. They have a quote from a childhood friend in page 127. "Well, Kissinger did not like Kennedy, that I can tell you." Page 128. "Most of the neighbors liked Anne because she was friendly, and as one put it, she wasn't oppressively Jewish-looking. The Kissingers never could have bought the house through Belmont's fuzzy real estate agents," the neighbors said. "It was purchased direct from the estate of the deceased owner." Continues on the same page. "And Kissinger, he never did the chores. They had a man keep the lawn. But most damning of all, he was remote. Belmont Hill might have been cool to Jews, but it perturbed Miss August deeply that Kissinger was cool to Belmont Hill." Page 129. "He was on a different wavelength from the people around here. He came to the parties, but he wouldn't be friendly just for the sake of being friendly. He always had to have a reason. Someone told me once why Jewish people spoil their boys, and it makes sense. Because they still believe the Messiah is coming, and any one of them could be the Messiah." Brody, now semi-retired and teaching part-time at UCLA, is philosophical about the book that made Kissinger's reputation not his. Other people had made the same arguments, but his book hit the market at the right time. Page 135. "Others lambasted the Kissinger book, not for its footnotes, but for its errors. The major error was that the book was written," said Ralph E. Lapp, a widely published, 14 books, military analyst in Washington. "It was a basic strategy blunder based on the idea that you could invent rules of war, that you could exchange limited nuclear blows without escalating. None of us believed that, and Kissinger admitted the mistake. His fundamental assumptions were specious." Page 136. This is Chapter 11, The Breakup. It says, as he neared 40, Kissinger's marriage to the woman he had known half his life began to come apart. They were not the kind to discuss things in public, but signs of deep stress had been visible to the couple's close friends for years. And as the gulf between them widened, it brought unmistakable changes in both partners. In Kissinger's case, the most obvious change was physical. The clues were numerous. He bought himself a sun lamp, a new wardrobe, and a Mercedes-Benz, his first since the days in Bensheim as Minister Henry. Continues on page 137. The man at the London airport did not recognize Kissinger. He had apparently been taking some exercise and dieting, Schelling said, and he was using a sun lamp. The effect was amazing. He had lost 20 pounds, his skin color had improved, and he was in better emotional health. I just underlined it because I found it incredible that you think Kissinger and these, diplomats and these people, intellectuals, are so above everyone else's shallowness and superficiality, but he's just as susceptible. This is page 138. Kissinger felt no binding commitment to Rockefeller at this early stage of their relationship, of course. He had, in fact, made tentative contact with the Kennedy camp at least a year before the 1960 election, recalls a woman who worked for Kissinger at Harvard in the late 50s. When Kissinger got a letter from Kennedy asking if he would help out, she said he told her, just send him off a letter and say, of course I'll work for him. And it happened. She left 6 months later to join the Kennedy campaign. Henry got very angry. She thought Kissinger's lack of commitment to Rockefeller was disconcerting, and she later mentioned it to JFK himself. He laughed and said, oh, don't worry, all those professors are like that. Yet when the NSC consultancy opened up, it apparently was Kissinger who chose to make it a part-time, 1 or 2 days a week. He could not afford another leave of absence from Harvard without tenure, and Kissinger probably had no illusions now of sharing any real power on the new frontier. Not only was he Rockefeller's man, but Kennedy clearly had a surplus of intellectuals. Oh, by the way, Kissinger, he was, there's a thing in the book about how Kissinger always wanted tenure in Harvard, and he never got it. Like, that was a big deal with never getting tenure. That was a big deal with Kissinger. Anyways, it keeps going. I remember him telling me he was mortified and humiliated and tongue-tied in the presence of Ashelong, Bundy, and Kennedy, a Harvard source said. They were so witty he couldn't scintillate like the jet set, and they never called him. Page 139. The short, unhappy life of Henry Kissinger in the Kennedy administration has had several interpretations, differing only in which misfortune is emphasized. Kissinger was supposed to be consulted on German policy in particular, but when the Soviets suddenly built the Berlin Wall in August 1961, and Kissinger warned that it could lead to war if unchallenged, Kennedy and Bundy ignored him. That was one misfortune. Another came when Kissinger opposed the nuclear multilateral force for NATO nations proposed by Harvard professor Robert Bowie, one of Kissinger's bitterest rivals. Kennedy favored the MLF proposal. Bundy fended off any protests. The score was now 2-0 against Kissinger. Page 141, a quote from Carl Friedrich. I am as astounded as everybody. He was always a bit clumsy and not particularly good at human relations. Not a born diplomat, to be sure. I would love to sit down and say, Henry, what's your technique? Friedrich outlined his pet theory of successful negotiation, that there are 3 schools, persuasion, threat, and purchase. Henry has something of all 3 and has the intelligence to perceive which will work at what time. When he doesn't succeed with persuasion, he's intelligent enough to say, well, what's it worth to you? And he won't hesitate to threat. Most diplomats have either one quality or the other, but Henry has a rich assortment. There's a quote from page 142. His parents were both very sweet and dear people. You know how it is often with Jews, they feel a qui-vive. They're ashamed of their parents. Not Henry. Not Henry. Page 143. Yet Kissinger had no real relation with the Jewish community as a Jewish community here, Friedrich said. It is not inviting here for a boy to be pro-Israel. Was he saying there is anti-Semitism at Harvard? Very much so, yes. They had a number of extended disagreements on the subject of Israel. Henry didn't like my pro-Zionism. He thought it was all wrong for America. Page 146. The children, until they reached an age where Kissinger could talk to them, were a mere adjunct to their mother in his eyes, a neighbor thought. I never saw him out walking with them when he lived here, and I remember after the breakup he would come in this very fancy Mercedes to pick up the kids after a long absence. And once he said, oh, look what I've done for you children, I've had the car washed. The whole thing was heartbreaking. Page 147. That July, when Anne went to Reno for 6 weeks, no one was surprised, not even in Washington Heights. The divorce was the first in the old Beth Hillel group, and maybe the last. But some considered it quite logical. Henry was on the way up, one husband shrugged. He had to get rid of everything that was holding him back. Anne was badly shaken. For a while she considered moving back to New York to be near her widowed mother and Lenore. But she was a 39-year-old divorcee now, with all her social roots in Boston, and 2 small children who might need such roots. Anne chose to stay. She sold the Fletcher Road house for $60,000 to a Belmont couple who had contacted her as soon as word spread of the Kissingers' separation. Good houses were scarce. Anne rented a smaller vine-covered brick front on nearby Louise Road, still on top of the hill, and took the children out of nursery school for economy's sake. Their father was paying for their support, of course, and presumably alimony as well, although the divorce papers were kept sealed. There was no third party involved, one of Anne's relatives insists. They were just 2 people who couldn't live in the same house. We're now on Chapter 12, The Star, page 151. He always made a point of having a good-looking girl. I think that's why he gave up his wife. He had these other things going. But I remember whenever he went to New York or Paris for any reason, it was always understood that he was going to see a girl, too. What we could never figure out, though, was that it was the same girl in New York and Paris. Page 154. In those days, the benefit of clout were relatively limited, but still measurable. Kissinger's stardust gave him some leeway to thumb his nose at the hierarchy of the Harvard government department when it seemed necessary. He rarely set foot in his office there, preferring to use the seminar office on Divinity Street or a cubicle in the new Holyoke Center. It also enabled him to resist occasional pressure from the State Department and the CIA to invite specific foreign luminaries to the seminar, though some sources say Kissinger curried favor in Washington by bowing too often to such pressure. Abby Fitcher says, the seminar ran on a shoestring in its latter days, hence the acceptance of government travel grants. Donations from the big foundations were drying up, and Kissinger had to scramble for funds for the seminar. We'd talk over the possible sources, and he'd say what to do. He wouldn't let us send form letters for fundraising. We would write letters in his name, and he signed them, always including a personal note, even to strangers. He was very exacting about this. Page 154. This is a quote from a guy named Hargadon, last name Hargadon. The girls would type 400 letters to foundations, and Kissinger would go around groaning, no money, no money. Then money would come through from 7 foundations, and he'd say, see how I get the money? Then it would turn out that all 7 were CIA fronts. Kissinger would say very emphatically, I did not know that. But for a guy who didn't know anything, he sure had a lot of them. Page 167. Kissinger at 45 still had the security of a good job at Harvard, but his pet project, the International Seminar, was now on the ropes due to public disclosure of CIA involvement in its financing. The seminar, in fact, would never rise again. Kissinger was faced with the bleak prospect of remaining what he would later describe as a professor at $1.95 a week. His kid brother Walter had become a rip-roaring success. Walter retired that year at 44, a millionaire. Page 174. This is the beginning of Chapter 14, The Advisor. The line of authority between Rogers' State Department and Kissinger's National Security Council was drawn early. In Nixon's first pep talk to the NSC staff, he promised them that they would be free of pressure from the State Department. We were in the cabinet room, sitting there smoking our pipes, Morris recalls, and Nixon said, look, I know what you have to deal with, he pointed at the State Department. That place is impossible, he said. They were always screwing up when I was vice president. Of course, Nixon didn't realize that 2/3 of the guys sitting in that room were Foreign Service officers detached from state. He went on saying, Henry and I will end the war. I want you guys to run the rest of the world. So just to recap the story so far, so Henry Kissinger is born in Germany. He's Jewish, so they immigrate to the United States. Then he comes back as a soldier. He is really smart, so he's enrolled in this academic thing. He has a mentor there named Kramer, right? Sergeant Kramer. Then eventually he goes to college. And one part I didn't emphasize enough, but there's a bunch of testimonials of his classmates saying that Henry Kissinger was always reading, always, nonstop, always studying, always reading. After that, he became a professor at Harvard, but he never got tenure. And that was a big problem with him was that he always wanted to get tenure at Harvard, but they never gave it to him. But he ran this really successful, the International Seminar, and it was a real who's who at Harvard. He would run it. He met a bunch of diplomats and a bunch of important people, internationally important people. And he met Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller, who was a presidential candidate. And he was there in his campaign. And Rockefeller was a big stepping block for Henry Kissinger into power. And then after meeting Rockefeller, eventually the international seminar dies down. And he divorces his wife, his first wife, and gets a tan and starts to lose weight. Goes through this midlife crisis or something, but what we're talking about now is him being and he was sort of an advisor for JFK, but he didn't really have much power. It wasn't that big of it. JFK didn't really listen to him. But so this is him as a national security advisor under Nixon. He's not Secretary of State yet, but he starts out as National Security Advisor for Nixon. Page 182. When Time ran its cover story on Kissinger that February, the word was avoided altogether. He's a European by birth, the story confided. It carried a picture of Sergeant Kissinger at Berchtesgaden in uniform, with only the date 1945 added to the caption so that Time readers wouldn't think Kissinger was the chauffeur of Hitler. In his childhood, Kissinger was quoted as saying, "The other children would beat us up." And the writer noted in passing that his life under the Nazis became difficult and dangerous, but nowhere did the story say whether he was a Jew or a gypsy. Page 182. It was not the media that saved Kissinger from the aggression of Haldeman and Ehrlichman, his former aides suggest. It was Kissinger's own ready espousal of an aggressor foreign policy, the secret bombing of Cambodia in 1969, the incursion into Cambodia in 1970, the support of Pakistan's bloody assault on Bangladesh in 1971, the mining of Haiphong Harbor, and the Christmas bombing of Hanoi in 1972. Kissinger approved the hardline policy without reservation in public, to the dismay of a number of aides who were prepared to admire him. Many of us soured when Vietnam rolled on, one said. And after his incredible statement that Vietnam is not a moral issue, even in private, Kissinger made it clear that he considered Vietnam something to be ended, but strategically unimportant. Page 184. Whether Kissinger supported Nixon's hardline policies in private is debatable. As Ralph Lapp had observed of Kissinger, you listen to him and you could interpret what he says any way you want. On the day of the Cambodia invasion in 1970, former aides say, Kissinger told us NSC staff, "Our leader has flipped his lid, but you're all expected to rally round. If you can't, get out. We can't have any carping in the back room." When four of his original NSC stars, Lake, Lynn Morris, and William Watts, did decide to get out in protest against Cambodia, Kissinger angrily berated them for quitting, Morris said. He regarded me and Tony Lake as knee-jerk Harvard liberals who could be calculated to oppose a harmless invasion of Cambodia. To those who opposed blood in the streets, who couldn't see what is accomplished by bombing innocents without getting anything, he'd say, you have to look at the stakes. He talked about brutal blows and savage blows to establish our credibility with the other side. Page 186. We had an awful fight. He kept talking about the need for brutal blows. I had no feeling that he had any misgivings. Kissinger is supposed to have agonized over Cambodia decision, but I never sensed any of that famous anguish, which is most touching when he alludes to his immigrant background. I never found him distressed at the direction of things, not that he was delighted in doing it. Nixon wanted to, and Kissinger was willing to go along. Page 188. I said, no, we're 12 people who no longer trust the President of the United States and his national security advisor to conduct the foreign policy of this nation. We're scared to death of the increasing isolation of the leaders of this government. I also made it clear that everything we said was on the record. Henry said, may I go off the record to respond? I told him, no, we're committed that there be no secrets. Henry said, then there's not much I can say except to ask you to withhold judgment for 12 months. Kissinger was shaken by the confrontation, a former NSC aide said, because he was in a trap. Since they insisted he speak on the record, he couldn't tell them what he was saying socially all over Washington, that Nixon was mad. Page 197. Some ex-NSC aides make it a basic proposition that Kissinger lies to everyone. He's so pathological, he could probably pass a lie detector test, one said. All the people he talks to seem to believe they were told the truth, and only others are lied to. Kissinger reinforces that by implying that he has to please the other side out of necessity, but he's telling the truth. Even if contradictions come out, he's emotionally incapable of stopping it. No act of his is spontaneous. Even the appearance of sentimentality or truth is calculated for its effect. Kissinger doesn't perceive this as cold or amoral because he's a man obsessed with one basic thesis, a monomanic of sorts. That this basic thesis is to a large degree valid and is shared by Nixon and was there, unarticulated in Nixon's mind before they met, explains part of the bond between the two men. His version of this ex-aide's version of Kissinger's thesis was this. Given that the overriding danger of the world is the threat of nuclear holocaust, it is essential that the U.S. communicate with and get tough with the Russians on a regular basis, even to the threat of force, so that the Russians will not do those things which, if done, would be a real threat to the U.S. national interest. Nothing is forever except the danger. The antidote to the danger lies in the continuing process itself, the repeated application of the course of action. Page 198. State Department sources dispute this theory that Kissinger's philosophy centers on a bipolar U.S.-Soviet balance and that all else flows or ceases to flow from it. One key assistant said Kissinger's general thrust is to a more stable multipolar world, and that only in the strict military sense is the U.S.-Soviet relationship still the central pillar. In political and economic areas, there are other major actors. Kissinger's idea is to move from two big coalitions to a world in which each has a stake in preserving peace. With the communist bloc now fractured, Russia versus China, and Western Europe stronger than ever, he said, the U.S. is relieved of the burden it once had, and its drift to isolation can be halted. I found that interesting, because I did want to learn about the man's life, but I also wanted to learn about what he believed, what he preached, his ideology. Of course, it's very difficult to learn that stuff because if you read, like, his books are so huge, it's quite an endeavor. But this is my first attempt. Page 206. In Munich that September, after the Arab terrorist murder of 11 Israeli athletes at the Olympic Games, a freight elevator at the Regina Palace Hotel fell to the basement with a thump. Kissinger was aboard, and sabotage was suspected, but it was only a case of too many security guards with him overloading the elevator. It took Munich firemen 20 minutes to extricate them. This is Chapter 16, The Passions, page 208. By chance, Miss Miller was Kissinger's date the next evening at a Hollywood dinner party. This was much more decorous date. Ann Miller had been a movie dancer, one of the best, for enough years to be Kissinger's sister. We're getting along real well, she recalls, with him calling me Anne and me calling him Henry. But then I brought up what I had seen the night before, she recalls. I told him our boys in Vietnam are getting their heads shot off and they read this stuff in the papers. They're going to think their leaders are empty-headed playboys. Henry became furious. Miss Miller, he said, I was no longer Anne. You don't know anything about me. I was miserable in a marriage for most of my life. I never had any fun. Now is my time to enjoy myself. When this administration goes out, I'm going back to being a professor at $1.95 a week. But while I'm in the position I'm in, I'm damn well going to make it count. Page 210. If you are Dr. Strangelove, Joseph Kraft remarked, you need cosmetics. Kissinger is fairly uncomfortable in that swinger pose. But subconsciously he asks himself, how do I get away from being Dr. Strangelove? And the answer is by becoming a real American, by fulfilling the American dream. The dream turned into rich fantasy, and it was turned into satire by some. The Harvard Lampoon concocted a 2-page centerfold of Kissinger reclining in the nude, a cigar in his hand and his spectacles firmly in place, grinning at the camera. The paunchy body was that of a Boston taxi driver, artistically fused onto Henry's head, an alternation Kissinger accepted when he sighed, "It makes me look 20 pounds lighter." It began at a party for Gloria Steinem in October 1969 at Barbara Hauer's home. Kissinger had been in Washington for 10 months without much of a social life. Sally Quinn of the Washington Post found him nursing a drink in the corner. She took out her ballpoint pen and needle. "You really are a swinger, aren't you?" she asked. Kissinger could have answered no, and there might have been no legend. Instead, he said, well, you couldn't really call me a swinger because of my job. Why don't you just assume I'm a secret swinger? Sally Quinn printed it. Now Kissinger tells her, you made me what I am today. Miss Steinem, the ranking feminist spokeswoman, expressed disgust with the lioness, who then began pursuing Kissinger. If this were the Kennedy administration, no one would pay attention to him, she said. When her name was quickly linked to his, Miss Steinem assured her constituents, I'm not now and never have been a girlfriend of Henry Kissinger. Kissinger told the Washington Press Club, I'm not discouraged. After all, she did not say that if nominated, she would not accept, or if elected, she would not serve. Continued on page 211. His amorous adventures were limited for a while. The accent was on companionship. Mostly we ate, said Marcia Metrinko, who said she dated Kissinger dozens of times in Washington, New York, and California. I was always home by midnight. He usually had work to do later, she said. There always seemed to be a crisis. In San Clemente, he'd get called away from the table a lot. Not that he didn't flirt, he'd tease a joke, although he doesn't laugh a lot. He's a very physical person. He touches your hair and holds your hand under the table. Page 212. Barbara Howard laughingly told the world that Henry's idea of sex is to slow the car down to 30 miles an hour when he drops you off at the door. A newspaper woman who kept score concluded, I don't think he gets nearly as much ass as everyone thinks. When Kissinger seemed to be spending a lot of time with a TV celebrity, a mutual friend almost guaranteed it was platonic. I'll bet you $100 million he never touched her. It continues on the same page. I'll bet 10 to 1 he does not get laid at all, said a journalist who traveled with Kissinger. When he goes out on dates, it's because he wants to enhance his image. Henry's middle finger has done nothing but push a pen. He has got 24 hours a day to do his job, all foreign affairs, no domestic. It continues on 212, but he still lacked the controlled panache of his brother Walter, the millionaire businessman who rode horses and motorcycles. In a room of 100 women, said a man who has known both brothers since childhood, 75 of them would gravitate to Walter. Page 213. He nagged White House Social Secretary Lucy Winchester about his dinner partners. Henry would accost me at breakfast, she said, and he'd say, Lucy, you seated me next to a 98-year-old crone last night. Winchester would explain that protocol dictated the seating arrangements. I don't give a damn about protocol, he'd say. Bring out the beautiful spice. It was hard to determine in advance whether any of the guests at a White House dinner would be bosomy enough for Kissinger. So Lucy Winchester would have her aides scan the arriving woman for what she called the cleavage factor. Then the aides would race back to report the name of the winner, and Winchester would put her place card next to Kissinger's. Can you believe that? Holy smokes, those were different times. Page 214. Kissinger attended pro football games with Nixon speechwriter William Safire, who later became a New York Times columnist. Safire remembers a Washington Redskins game when the public address system notified a doctor to call his office. Henry got a faraway look in his eyes and said, you know how we could really empty the stadium out fast? We could ask the announcer to say, Dr. Kissinger, call your office. It's urgent. He was a Redskins fan, but when spectators booed a referee's ruling with shouts of bad call and poor judgment, Kissinger would be unable to resist leaping up and yelling, on what theory? Page 214. Kissinger's social patroness from the start was Joan Braden, wife of columnist Tom Braden. When he wanted to give a party to reciprocate for some of the parties he had attended, the Bradens loaned him their spacious house and garden in suburban Chevy Chase for a candlelit dinner dance. Kissinger hired an orchestra and some waiters and repaid 34 people. I think I underlined that because, what? There's a place called Chevy Chase? Page 214. It was not charming to everyone. F. Scott Fitzgerald's daughter Scotty sat next to Kissinger at a garden party for 30 people in the summer of 1973 and found herself in direct line of fire as he dominated the table talk. I was absolutely paralyzed by the man, she said. Couldn't say a word. He kept pontificating. He offends me because he's one of those people who's persuaded he's right. Those people frighten me. He was a man who seemed to know everything in the world. He boasted of his power. He was always talking about power, and he used that word quite a bit. Nancy McGinnis fixed breakfast there on occasion, other sources say, and as soon as she was married, she complained to Washington Post publisher Kay Graham what a dump it was. There's nothing there you need. You want to press a skirt? Well, there's no ironing board. Would you believe it? And no iron. And no emery board, no scissors. You open the drawer where the scissors ought to be, and it's not there. There is no scissors. Do you know how he doesn't even have a safety pin? Henry Kissinger is really my best male friend, Jill said, after several dates. I can call him at 3 a.m. with my problems and talk to him for hours, and he won't mind. I underlined it because I thought, that described him getting friend-zoned. Page 216. Yitzhak Rabin, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, now premier, told me that he once asked several prominent Jews, what kind of Jew is Kissinger? Can he be trusted? And one told him that when Kissinger was dating Jill St. John, his father was anxious. St. John is not a Jewish name. But Kissinger called his father to assure him that the girl was Jewish, that her real name is Jill Oppenheim. And it was true. Page 217. He was really coming on to me, and I thought it was a little weird with Jill sitting there, Lada said. But he and Jill have a strange relationship. They seem to get off on each other's sexual achievements. Kissinger asked Lada for a date for the next evening. She, of course, refused, but Jill urged her on, Lada said. So she went. I told him I'd pay for the tab since it would be such a boost for my career, she laughed. Kissinger laughed too. But he became very nervous about it. I got the distinct impression that he had been told to cool it about the publicity, to cool his Hollywood thing. He picked her up the next night, and they went to a benefit for Milton Berle, attended by numerous stars and politicians. He's extremely bright, witty, and intelligent, Lada said. I was planning to do my Young Democrat number on him, but he managed to skillfully avoid any accusations I made. On the way back to my house, he told me the Secret Service had told him he could not spend any time at my house or pick me up there again because the narrow road could be blocked off too easily. Lada lives on a one-lane road in the Hollywood Hills. And he said, we'll have to meet somewhere else in the future. And I said, my mother told me I should never go to a man's house. And that was the end of my Henry Kissinger experience. Page 217. Even when he scored in Hollywood, Henry was found wanting. One jaded starlet attracted to celebrities confessed that she indeed made it with Kissinger, all the way to nowhere. He's really boring, she demurred. No preliminaries, and in such a hurry. Page 218. There was a little talk in the film world about the advisor enjoying marijuana on occasion, although he never had learned to inhale a conventional cigarette. His closer friend in Hollywood insisted they had never seen him use marijuana, not even with Jill. Page 219. But Sonnenfeld was saying Kissinger's cult was largely created by other people's press agents. And there's something to that. Here's an exchange from page 220. Male reporter, what's your opinion of Henry Kissinger? Ms. Van Dorn, devastating. Kissinger, write that down for God's sake. Page 220. This is a quote from Robert Evans, production chief of Paramount Pictures. 2 years ago, when The Godfather opened, I invited him to the opening, and Marlon Brando was supposed to come out, but he canceled at the last moment. I was very distraught. There was no star to promote the New York premiere of a very expensive movie. And then Henry called and said, I have a very important meeting and I can't make it. I said, Henry, I need you here tonight. I hate to impose on you. I know how important your work is, but it would be extremely important to me if you could just fly up here and be here tonight. And he said, I'll be there. And he was, and the next day, Women's Wear Daily had this big spread on Kissinger being the hit of the opening. Page 222. Evans took Kissinger to Acapulco. We went into a little German restaurant, and two people about 80 years old came up to us, and they didn't recognize Kissinger, and they put us at the worst table. We didn't say anything. A little while later, the old German man comes over and peers at him and says, you know, you look a lot like Henry Kissinger. And Henry said, a lot of people tell me that. Page 223. For Ruta Lee was heaven. I'm starstruck by power, she said frankly. I think it's the closest thing that America has to royalty. I care very little about how a man looks, but I truly respect someone who has achieved greatness. I thought that was a funny, backhanded compliment. Page 224. On the day of our date, he was supposed to arrive at 6:30, Susan Oliver said. At 7:30, a nondescript cream-colored compact arrives, sprouting all sorts of Rube Goldberg antennas. Kissinger gets out. We got lost, he apologized. Page 226. After belly dancer Nadia Parsa plopped into his lap at a Tehran nightclub, Kissinger told the photographers, "She's a charming girl and very interested in foreign policy. I spent some time explaining to her how you could convert an SS-7 to a Y-class submarine. I want to make the world safe for Nadias. Double macho on occasion. Some say make love, not war. I am trying to do both." Page 226. He told Danielle Hannibal not to pressure him because he had been the victim of my wife's blackmail for 14 years and could not take no more pressure. Yet he sent roses to Anne on her birthday long after their divorce, a courtly gesture that Kissinger could not seem to forgo. Page 226. Frank Harris, his boyhood friend from Fourth, said he had a question to Kissinger when they visited briefly in Washington. I said to him, "When we were young, I always had more sex appeal than you." He laughed and said, "But I have the power." Page 227. Kissinger has a very Arab attitude towards women. They're not really important in the world scheme of things. A friend of Kissinger's made a similar observation when asked why Kissinger doesn't negotiate with women as equal partners as successfully as he deals with government leaders. Henry Kissinger wouldn't accept that, he said. "You know, Henry's more Arab than the Arabs." Page 229. Those were heady months for the 50-year-old German refugee after 5 years as a mere White House advisor. The stain of Watergate engulfing the Nixon administration had yet to touch Kissinger. It had been Watergate, in fact, that opened his path to the State Department. It continues on the same page. Egyptian diplomats were openly hoping for a little bit of Kissinger magic that they felt had brought peace to Vietnam. Page 229. Nixon's inner circle at the White House almost sidetracked the move to promote Kissinger. "I don't think that was their plan," Nelson Rockefeller told us 6 months later. "They had others. But I felt it was tremendously important that for Henry to carry the responsibilities of the Arab-Israeli conflict, he couldn't be negotiating with the Defense Department and the State Department and so forth, not with the president preoccupied." Continues on page 229. More irony. In early 1972, there's speculation that Rockefeller might succeed Rogers as Secretary of State, a subordinate position, in effect, with Kissinger running foreign policy. "Forget it," a Rockefeller aide said. He could never work under Kissinger. Page 230. Mary McGrory, the Washington Star News columnist who scoffed at the Kissinger mystique with regularity, swept past his table at the San Souci restaurant in Washington at the height of the Hanoi bombing and said icily, "Merry Christmas, Henry." James Weschler had written earlier in the New York Post that Kissinger imparts no sense of personal horror over the human cost of the U.S. air war, and that any balance sheet of his accomplishments will be permanently marred by the memory of this Holocaust. As Haig had observed, Kissinger caught it from all sides. His main problem in the late 1972, though, was the White House. When Nixon was elected to his second term, Kissinger was out, Barbara Hauer said. There was no question. He told me that himself. They thought he'd been hanging around too many liberals, going to too many Georgetown dinners, and letting his thighs get too fat to click the heels often enough for Haldeman and Ehrlichman. So he was gone. He was all set to clean out his desk, but history gave him a reprieve. Page 231. So word leaked slowly around Washington that the good foreign policy had always been Henry, and the bad foreign policy had always been Mr. Nixon. Henry took China, and Mr. Nixon was given Bangladesh. It continues on the same page. On Saturday, September 22nd, 1973, 15 months after the Watergate break-in, 5 months after Haldeman and Ehrlichman resigned, Kissinger was sworn in as America's first foreign-born Secretary of State. His salary was $60,000 a year, which meant a $17,500 raise. Page 231. But even Pretzfelder said he was bothered about Kissinger using Nixon's New Testament. If I were ever to see him again, he said, I think I would ask him about that. You have to remember he was Jewish. Pretzfelder was Jewish too. He used the New Testament swearing in as the Secretary of State. Page 232. Kissinger excitedly observed that there is no country in the world where it is conceivable that a man of my origin could be standing here next to the President of the United States. Page 234. It was a region Kissinger had deliberately avoided as national security advisor. He was always reluctant to move into the Middle East because of his fears about what people inside the Nixon administration would say about his background, a former NSC aide said. He may have felt there wasn't anything to do in the Middle East because it was not a problem that he or anyone could achieve results on. He told Dobrynin, "When you are ready to be serious on the Middle East, I'll come in." When war came, the Russians briefly took a neutral and conciliatory stance, but by October 10th, Moscow became serious in a manner that caught Kissinger by surprise, since it clearly violated the detente he so cherished. The Soviets began a massive airlift to both Cairo and Damascus, an airlift including the deadly surface-to-air missiles with which Syria was wrecking the proud Israeli Air Force. 70 jet fighters were lost early. For the first time since 1948, Israel's very survival was menaced. The U.S. eventually sent 30% of its entire store of ammunition to Israel in the airlift that finally began 8 days after the war started. Once off the ground, the bundles for Israel made the Berlin airlift look like a Mattel toy operation, said a Deputy Defense Secretary James Schlesinger. The cost was $2.2 billion. Page 237. Midway through the Yom Kippur War on October 16, 1973, Vietnam intruded briefly on the world's consciousness once again. But by that time, hardly anyone remembered a 2-year-old White House joke. Who's going to get the Nobel Peace Prize, Le Duc Tho or Nixon? As political jokes have a way of doing, this one almost came to pass. But Watergate had already dragged Nixon down enough so that Le Duc Tho to share the Nobel Peace Prize with Henry Kissinger instead. It continues on the same page. Le Duc Tho said Paris was not a compromise, but a victory for his side. I found that interesting. I didn't know that. Kissinger gave his half share of the Nobel Peace Prize, $57,500, to a new Henry A. Kissinger Scholarship Fund for children of American GIs killed or missing in Indochina. Page 238. Only one thing has changed. The camera has shifted to the Mideast, another region in mortal danger of succumbing to asphyxiation by empty words. Everything moves in insane circles. The Nobel Peace Prize murdered peace in Vietnam, and in the Mideast, the cry peace is liable to delay it for 999 years. Baruch added another provocative note about Kissinger. His ex-wife feels that whoever gave him the Nobel Peace Prize didn't know what he was doing. Page 239. Kissinger's diffident attitude towards the Middle East came to a resounding end during the Yom Kippur War, most obviously when Moscow threatened to send 7 divisions of Soviet paratroopers, about 50,000 highly trained commandos, to intervene against Israel on October 24th. It continues on the same page. That was a quorum, more or less. Kissinger and Schlesinger made the decision for President Nixon on his authority, and in the basement of the White House that night, they ordered a global alert for U.S. military forces, a move that shocked the world. For 12 hours, there seemed to be a chance of nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Page 239. The global alert worked in the sense that war was avoided. It helped the Soviets back off in Security Council showdown 12 hours later, wherein both countries joined in a 14-0 vote to establish a peacekeeping force in the war zone, excluding all major powers. But Fritz Kramer, who had thought Kissinger lost one round to Le Duc Tho, now believed his old protege had lost another round to Brezhnev. Page 240. Kramer spelled out his interpretation. Henry gets a letter from Brezhnev. Not even a threat, just that we can't permit the Middle East to spoil detente. We must huddle. You come here. Talleyrand, who is the Kissinger pattern, not Metternich or Bismarck. I don't know where journalists get Metternich from. Henry, in his book, was very clearly patterned himself after Talleyrand. Henry forgets Talleyrand, who said, above all, no over-eagerness. Henry goes to Moscow too soon. Then the ceasefire is rammed down the UN. He was a very courageous soldier, which is remarkable because most intellectuals are not good soldiers. Henry volunteered for dangerous tasks. He's not physically afraid, not afraid at all of attempts on his life. He's afraid of not being approved. Page 240. The Secretary of State told his co-religionist intellectuals in the December 6 meeting that he had warned the Israelis from the start that as soon as they started winning, the United Nations would order a ceasefire, and that when the ceasefire was pressed, he, Kissinger, had deliberately stalled as much as possible. He claimed that he gave the Israelis an extra 4 days to improve their position, and that they knew it. Kissinger also told him that Israel had lost the war strategically, although it won it tactically. Yaffa reported. The fact that the Arabs could fight for 17 days and keep their armies intact was a victory for them. They must be regarded as the victors in the war, Kissinger said. While proclaiming that he had saved Israel with the airlift despite a minor mutiny against it in Washington, Kissinger had in fact laid the groundwork for her defeat, had he not? Hadn't he made a deal with Brezhnev in effect preventing Israeli forces from destroying the Egyptian Third Corps? Hadn't he sacrificed the security of the Jewish state in deference to detente and oil? Page 242. Approval and support were not the only goals of Kissinger's openness in private. He invited 16 academics to a Washington luncheon after the Arab-Israeli ceasefire for a proposed dialogue on NATO. He monologued, said Harvard's Stanley Hoffman. Mostly he was complaining about the Europeans' behavior during the Middle East crisis. He was angry that they did not support the United States. Page 243. On September 2, 1973, before Kissinger's confirmation as Secretary of State by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, an editorial had run in the New Hampshire Sunday News purporting to favor his confirmation, but headlined, incredibly, Kissinger the Kike? A bumper sticker turned up outside Woonsocket, Rhode Island, with the simple slogan, "Burn Jews, not oil." Another such sticker was seen in Los Angeles during the second week of February by one of the rabbis who on December 27th had met with Kissinger. The bumper sticker story did not make many newspapers. Was there a lid on it? Oh, I don't think so, the rabbi said. But on the other hand, sometimes when you publicize an anti-Semitic remark, you give currency to it. The rabbi, an Easterner, said he thought there was absolutely no evidence of a resurgence of anti-Semitism in the United States. Richard Yaffe pointed out that Kissinger himself had cited the probability of an oil shortage backlash in the U.S. against Israel when he met with the Jewish intellectuals on December 6, and that he had proved himself a bad prophet since a current Harris poll had showed popular support for Israel gaining in America, with the onus of the oil shortage being put on the Arabs. It continues on the same page. The Harris poll, however, coincided with the emergence of the bumper stickers, and Kissinger was receiving periodic reports of an increase in anti-Semitic literature compiled by sources in the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, beyond whatever hate mail was addressed to Kissinger direct at the State Department, a phenomenon never acknowledged publicly. One New York rabbi suggested that concern over an oil backlash was a manufactured anxiety created by the ADL and other defense organizations devoted to defending the comfortable position of most Jews in the United States. They were hurt by the Yom Kippur War, according to this person, because Jews here contributed heavily to Israel's support and less to the defense organizations here. Page 244. The what if he comes a cropper theory had been displaced by the what if he leans over backwards theory. Jews, particularly in Israel itself, are fearful that Kissinger will betray his own people in his efforts to convince everyone that he's being even-handed. Page 244. Adam Baruch wrote, "The Messiah is supposed to be Jewish, but Jews are leery about messiahs because most of who have aspired to that role in the past have caused a lot of trouble, from Jesus on." A few weeks after the ceasefire, Joseph Kraft and other journalists reported a major depressant in the mood of Israel towards Kissinger. In Tel Aviv, a cartoon showed an Israeli soldier running to an air raid shelter shouting, "Kissinger's coming!" And the Arabs were calling him the snake charmer in Cairo. Page 244. It was in these circumstances that Kissinger summoned the 7 Jewish intellectuals to his office on December 6 and the 14 rabbis and businessmen 3 weeks later. His message to both groups was substantially the same. There were some additional points made in his message to the second group, however, as well as some points deleted, according to participants in the December 27 meeting. Point 1. Kissinger asked the rabbis and Jewish business leaders on December 27 not to applaud his efforts in the Middle East because it might undermine his credibility with the Arabs. Point 2, he told the intellectuals on December 6 that some doubt existed whether a second airlift to Israel would be possible if the need arose, because Portugal might not permit the US C-5 cargo transports to refuel in the Azores as they had in October. Point 3, he told the rabbi groups that he and Nixon were the only members of the American establishment to support the October airlift. They also have a point 4 and a point 5. Page 246. The fortune profile of James Schlesinger came out in December, and some Israeli commentators were hailing the Secretary of Defense as the real architect of the airlift. This one is this was an impression that Kissinger had been trying hard to dispel ever since, perhaps starting at the rabbis' meeting. He continues on the same page. He said on December 6th that Israel must be prepared to settle quickly the issue of a return to its 1967 borders because peace is not in the interest of the Arabs, and the Arabs would profit by further conflict, a reality that many Arabs are not aware of, Kissinger said. His point was that Soviet military technology had changed the balance in the Middle East. Page 247. Kissinger conceded that he could not speak for all his motivations as a United States diplomat, but said he did not think that his religion would lead him to be weak in support of Israel. As one whose relatives had died in concentration camps, Kissinger said he could not help but be emotionally involved in Israel's survival. This is chapter 18, The Savior, page 248. Rabbi Daniel Silver, son of the late Zionist leader Abba Hillel Silver, in a January sermon in Cleveland, intensely critical of Kissinger, said, "Could Mr. Kissinger see the destruction of Israel? Yes. He knows that the black Christians of the Sudan are being systematically destroyed. He knows that Czechoslovakia could not win back its freedom. He knows that the Armenians have been persecuted out of significant existence. Israel destruction might give him pause for a night or become a paragraph in a book, but he recognizes that in the real world size counts and power counts, and that small nations often are erased." Page 250. Kissinger's detente with Russia has already proved a plus. There is something to show. Kissinger was given a list by American Jews on one of his early missions to Moscow of 1,000 hardcore cases of Jews blocked from leaving the Soviet Union. We've gotten many of them out. That was a quote by Rabbi Arthur Schneier. This is a quote from Zvi Riman. Kissinger doesn't speak of his Jewishness in private conversations. He's in the habit of saying, "I was born Jewish, but the truth is that it has no significance for me. This isn't pretense. America has given me everything. A home, a chance to study, and achieve such a high position. I don't know what other Jews expect of me, but I consider myself an American first." Page 252. Rabbi Israel Miller, when he talks to Sadat, he's not Jewish. When he talks to us, he'll refer to his Jewishness in a joking fashion. In our last meeting, he used the phrase Talmudic logic to describe an involved process. That was his only reference to his Jewishness. But he knew who he was talking to. I always wear a yarmulke. On the same page, 252. Do the Arabs see Kissinger as a Jew? Nelson Rockefeller? No. I think he jokes about this. He likes them. They're responsive. He tells me the Arabs are very much like Latins, if you treat them with dignity and respect. One of Kissinger's attempts to exchange pleasantries with King Faisal II of Saudi Arabia backfired a little. Kissinger saw a painting on the wall in Faisal's palace and idly inquired, "Is that an Arabian desert?" "That's a holy oasis," the king responded with a scowl. Kissinger later recalled telling himself, "Well, there's another 3 months of oil embargo." Page 253. He apparently knows all there is to know on Sadat the man. Obviously, he's a student of the psychology of the individual, and this is the base on which he decides how to approach each negotiation. Other sources observe that if Kissinger could order a CIA psychological profile on Daniel Ellsberg, why not one on Sadat? Page 253. Quote by Rabbi Daniel Silver. Kissinger made quite a to-do of the fact that the Israelis hadn't kissed him on both cheeks as the Arabs had done. Now, if you know German Jews, they're disciplined, intellectually aware, and sensitive, but the last thing they like is anybody slobbering all over them. Italics added. Kissinger is a man who seldom says anything he doesn't intend to say. Why this byplay? Certainly he wasn't saying he wanted Masha Dayan to kiss him on both cheeks. Rather, he was speaking to the Arab world and saying, "Look, when I'm among my own, I'm no closer to them than I am with you. In fact, I let you handle me in a way I don't allow them to handle me." Kissinger needs talking points with the Arab world. He needs to show them that being a Jew doesn't count. Quote from a former NSC aide. Once at a seminar on Vietnam, Kissinger was asked about the then-popular enclave theory and replied scornfully, "What do you mean? 3 Guantanamos and 2 West Berlins? The idea was that these places were untenable, embarrassing mistakes that have to be preserved for form." The Israeli public, for all its misgivings about the man, found itself nonetheless absorbed in the thumbnail sketches of Kissinger provided by journalists like Zvi Riman. The American Secretary of State hates nudniks, which means nincompoops, strong drink, and people who talk loudly. He loves sweets, especially chocolate with nuts. Kissinger also hates long ceremonies. They once presented a performance of a local dance troupe for him abroad. After 15 minutes, he was seen secretly reading memos which he had received that morning in Washington. He likes to walk with his hands in his pockets, to bite his nails, and to talk with interesting people. His method in the talks was something like this. He begins by saying, "I propose that today we talk about Articles A, B, and C," and he looks around to see if there is any opposition on the part of anyone present. When they start dealing with Article A and it is apparent that they're not getting any place, he says, "Okay, let's leave that for last." His aim is to reach agreement on at least one point at the very first meeting at all cost. Page 256. To both parties, which wanted to give him briefs on their positions, he immediately said, "Thanks, but no thanks," reported Madi Golan in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. In contrast to Dr. Gunnar Jaring, one of whose briefs destroyed his mission, Kissinger preferred to avoid formulations which the parties would later find difficult to retreat from. What instilled trust in his shuttle diplomacy? A former NSC aide said the Middle East is one place where his eternal lying is an asset, because there everybody expects everyone else to lie to them. Continuing on page 256. The question is not who offers more, but who can deliver anything. The United States delivers less than the Soviets promised, but it can deliver. It delivered the ceasefire, the opening of the Geneva Conference, and the disengagement agreement. Page 257. If Israel is willing to give something up, let's say to take a really far-fetched example, Jerusalem, he says, "Don't. I will tell you when to give it up." Continuing on the same page, he tells them, "Don't play games. Tell me what you want." Then he says, "I can tell you that you won't get this, this, and this." And he gives them the reasons. So what he gets is basically the minimum they will accept. And he tells them, "Don't use me as your lawyer. Don't ask me to ask this and then come down to that when the other side says no. Tell me what you really need, and I'll tell you if it's realistic. If it is, I'll tell them it's realistic." Continuing on the same page, and he tells Sadat, "If you insist on this or refuse that, we'll give more weapons to Israel because your position isn't realistic." He threatens both sides, but only in his capacity as arbiter of realism, so they can't really say that it is the United States that is threatening them, but it really is. 258. Quote from Gershon Jacobson. 25 years ago, the Israelis started to build a new culture, and their pride was the army. The greatest thing an Israeli girl could do was marry a pilot, a phantom jet pilot, no longer a doctor or a teacher. The pilots who destroyed the Arab Air Force were heroes and became symbols. This, I think, is unfortunate. There was a reason. The Sabras felt that the people of the book had been massacred too much. But how did the Jews survive in the Moroccan ghettos? I would say by their religion. And in Israel, they lost their religion. The philosophy of the state, its educational system, its spirit underscored the physical, the military aspect of the country, and not its spirituality. I think it was a tragedy when the Jews from Israel went to foreign countries and met other Jews in synagogues, and they didn't even know what to do in the synagogues. If Israel was that corrupt, was it worth saving? I would expect a Jew in this day and age not to seek such an easy modus vivendi and not to give away as much of Israel's interests as he did. He took their security, their independence. He established a precedent that Israel has to take orders from the United States. The Israelis were not allowed to encircle Egypt's Third Army. The general said it was not with their consent. They were forced. I'm a hawk in the Middle East because I think when anybody comes and beats me between the eyes, I'd be foolish fellow to adopt a policy of turning the other cheek. But Kissinger was forced by Aramco or President Nixon or by the philosophy of not having Israel isolated. Page 259. Did the U.S. win the game? No, look on the map, Fritz Kramer said. See that our client is back from where it stood. Their clients are forward. Suez is now in the hands of Egypt and not of the U.S. client state. The Soviet Union stood aside easily. We did their job for them. Rabbi Daniel Silver, I doubt that in his heart Kissinger believes there is a detente with the Soviet Union. In no other 18-month period have Russian arms and power moved as far and as fast. It continues on the same page. Kissinger needs to mask what he does and to deny the reality he so prizes. This was never clearer than during the first week of the October War, when he could not allow himself to say what was in fact a fact, that the Soviet Union had precipitated this war and was using it for aggressive geopolitical purposes, that the war was in every sense a denial of détente. Page 260. Americans, he, Kissinger, wrote, enter negotiations with the assumption that they actually conclude. Another rabbi suggested that the Nixon administration's interest in the Middle East was in part military self-interest. The Yom Kippur War was a proving ground for the American weapons. Page 261. He says again and again in his writings that diplomacy should not seek peace. Why not? Because there cannot be such a thing as peace in the world. Page 261. Do him honor, but be a little suspicious, quoted Milton Himmelfarb, editor of the American Jewish Yearbook. That's what the medieval biblical scholar Rashi wrote about Moses' father-in-law. Page 262. The High Wire. One of his own graduate students, David Landau, saw Kissinger as a man racked with doubts. There's a deep melancholy about him, and a sense that you're dealing with a guy who has known unlimited tragedy and seen some of the bleakest parts of the landscape. Page 263. But on March 4th, Washington conceded that Kissinger had been the target of an assassination plot by Palestinian terrorists in Damascus the previous week. Page 264. He was America's most admired man, not only in Gallup poll country, but in some places that had no reason to admire him, such as Africa. Page 265. Barry Schweid, the AP's diplomatic correspondent, reported that on the flight home from Moscow, someone in the press corps idly asked Kissinger whether he was getting married, and Kissinger replied, absolutely. Since Kissinger had given the same response to the same question before, Schweid wrote, no one took the answer seriously. When the word came, of course, Kissinger was already married. Barbara Hauer, who had known Kissinger well for 5 years, was struck now by how isolated and friendless he seemed, despite the party circuit and platoons of starlets. I don't think there was anybody he could sit down with and say, sometimes I'm scared, or, hey, I'm really scared and I don't know if I can make it. Page 267. An East 60s neighbor said Nancy was washing 5 loads of laundry on Saturday morning, March 30. That afternoon at about 3 o'clock in Arlington, Virginia, she married the Secretary of State. Through the years, when a neighbor brought clippings for Louis Kissinger's scrapbook, he withheld pictures of Henry with that McGinnis girl, so Louis wouldn't get upset. I wouldn't bring him those, the neighbors said. They all had a kindly feeling for Louis Kissinger, as gentle in his old age as he had been as a schoolteacher in Fourth, and as humble. Page 268. Paula Kissinger was equally unassuming. At a beauty parlor, she was buttonholed by a woman whose son was a dentist or a lawyer, and had just done something marvelous which she regaled Miss Kissinger with at great length, another woman reported. Then she cut herself and said, here I am telling you about my son when it's your son who's doing so wonderfully. And Kissinger's mother said, a son is a son. Page 269. A Washington social critic comments, probably inaccurately but with notable bite. I don't think anybody except his own parents played the difference between the Jews and the Gentiles. They wouldn't come to his wedding because he married a Gentile girl, which I think is a delicious reverse number. I got a big kick out of that. His WASP girl wasn't good enough for the Jewish immigrants. There's something very dear in that. Sad, but dear. Page 271. I used to go down to Washington once a week or so and have lunch with Henry, Schlesinger said. I'd come home and tell my wife I was very encouraged, that Henry was the best thing in the Nixon administration. Then one day I heard that William F. Buckley was following the exact same scenario, having lunch with Kissinger and going home and telling his wife how great he was. I realized something was wrong, that Henry's just a charming man. Page 272. The potential of anti-Semitism does not bother Kissinger a bit, said Senator Javits. He doesn't feel if he stubs his toe it'll be bad for the Jews. He couldn't be Secretary of State if he did. He continues, he has shown the U.S. Jewish community and the Arabs and the others in the world by his own example what a U.S. Jew can be. He's a Jew who's willing to stand on the record of today as an American in his own right, not as a person who needs special treatment because of what happened in the past. The Israelis always give you a dose of the past as a rationale for what should be done in the present. Kissinger never refers to the past. Page 273. By adding Watergate to the legacy of Vietnam, Kissinger knows it's impossible to appeal for support for Nixon. Page 274. Dialogue with a State Department aide a few months after Kissinger was accused in 1973 of having initiated the 1969 wiretaps against his own staff and of having cooperated in the 1971 formation of the illegal Plumbers unit in the White House, all of which Kissinger denied. Question, is Kissinger clean? Answer, he tells us he's clean. I realize some things can be presented by people that can tarnish him. Question, is there a conspiracy to protect him? Answer: a conspiracy only in the sense that people not only lay off him because of the good things he's done, but because he hasn't done bad things, or not things that are that bad. There may be questions if some of his acts were wise, but there was no evil acts. Page 275. The real history of the Plumbers goes back to 1969, 2 years before the unit actually was formed. At that time, there had been many leaks, the most significant being the disclosure of the secret bombings of Cambodia. It continues on the same page. 4 years later, however, in May 1973, Acting Attorney General William D. Rackelshaus revealed that there had been 17 national security wiretaps and indicated that Kissinger had been instrumental in the wiretap program. The next day, Kissinger said, "It was my duty to safeguard sensitive data." Page 276. Morton Halperin filed a damage suit against Kissinger, his former NSC boss, challenging Kissinger's claim that he hadn't known beforehand that the wiretaps would be installed. The Department of Justice conceded in a paper filed in response to Halperin's suit that some taps were placed at Kissinger's specific request. The wiretap program worked this way. Kissinger supplied most of the names. Hoover got Mitchell to authorize the taps under the existing Mitchell doctrine that the Attorney General could okay national security wiretaps without a court order, a doctrine later overturned by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. Summaries of the wiretaps were then sent to Kissinger, as he has acknowledged. Page 277. Sullivan reportedly told Mardian that the transcript should be turned over to Nixon because once Hoover got his hands on them, he might use them to embarrass the administration. Page 277. Kissinger testified at his confirmation hearings. There were cases in which the sources of some leaks were discovered and in which appropriate action was taken. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee did not press the Secretary of State designate on this point. Halperin subsequently charged that Kissinger had ended Halperin's access to classified material 3 days before the tap was placed on his phone, an indication that Kissinger did know what was in the wind. There's a quote from page 279. Obviously, he is technically liable to a perjury charge. Page 280. If you indicted each cabinet officer who lied under oath to Congress, few would be out of jail. And then it continues on the same page. He had to catch these guys who were doing the leaking because he felt exposed. He had, after all, brought Ellsberg into the administration at the start. Page 280, Chapter 20, The Power. In London in 1940, while the Luftwaffe ignited fires faster than they could be put out, an Englishman coined a cheerful line that said a lot about Britain's grim spirit. The difficult we do immediately, the impossible takes a little longer. In Washington in 1972, before the Watergate flames began to lick around the White House, Henry Kissinger made a joke. The illegal we do immediately, the unconstitutional takes a little longer. The difference in the spirit of it offended some critics who decided Kissinger was joking about Vietnam and Cambodia. Nobody knew then about the wiretaps and the Plumbers. Page 282. Something misfired and 3 pool reporters were led into the State Department auditorium. Kissinger was advocating détente with the Soviet Union, arguing that nuclear war would bring chaos. Look at the disarray in Europe after World War I in 1919, when none of the national governments were legitimate as a result of the devastation. What Kissinger said was, there have been very rarely fully legitimate governments in any European country since World War I. The implication was that this was still true. I assume there are no reporters present, Kissinger said, but the press officer, George Vest, yelled from the rear. The reporters were there. Kissinger ended the briefing as soon as he could. Vest released the briefing transcript, then called the New York Times to ask that the quote about European governments be played down. The Times played it up instead. The next day, Vest released a clarifying Kissinger statement which merely focused more attention on the issue. Page 283. Kissinger finally contended that he hadn't meant to denigrate the existing NATO governments, but the storm he had raised in Europe would not subside. Europeans had considered Kissinger their friend since the Kennedy days, when he consistently supported the national interest of France and West Germany. Another ex-NSC aide. It's a global shell game, with all those shells continually in movement so that no one can see that there is no real U.S. power beneath any of them. If anyone calls the bluff, it could be the most disastrous situation. Kissinger also employed another device known as the back channel, which was considered ingenious as Allison explained it. Unbeknownst to the thousands who worked on the SALT studies, S-A-L-T studies, or the hundreds or even the tens, Kissinger created a back channel where he negotiated the most serious business. They were not consulted, they were not even informed. There were the American delegates earnestly presenting a proposal that the back channel meant as a negotiating ploy for marking time. The Soviet delegates, initially impressed with the Americans' fastidiousness in going through all the motions, and then the dawning recognition that their American counterparts did not know. This is a scene Kafka would be proud of. It is no secret that Kissinger used the same strategy in handling Vietnam, China, and the Middle East. It continues on the same page. Jackson's target issue is the Kissinger crusade for détente with the Soviet Union, long considered President Nixon's major contribution to history, but ultimately appropriated by Kissinger. Page 286. Jackson told a New York TV audience on March 3, 1974, "Let's say to the Russians, okay, you need all this help, but why are you spending such a disproportionate amount of your total economic output on arms? Far in excess of anything in our government. Let's say instead of having these 1,618 huge land-based missiles, we have 1,000, or let's say both countries go down to some new level, say 800. Russians will save billions of dollars. We'll save billions of dollars. Okay, same thing with submarines. Why do they need 62 submarines and we 44? Let's both countries be at a level of equivalence, but a lower level of 30. Détente's a French word for which we don't have a counterpart in English, but it's an understanding, a better relationship with another country." Page 286. Kissinger wasted no opportunity to placate Moscow. When Bobby Fischer threatened to walk out of the championship chess match with Boris Spassky of Russia, Kissinger phoned Fischer in Iceland and urged him to stay. Although it might have been better for détente if Fischer had left, of course, considering his humiliation of Spassky. Page 288. Talmadge said to Kissinger, "It seems to me that we're applying one standard to a country that is relatively weak." Kissinger responded, "Well, of course, as I pointed out, there is the question of compliance with the UN resolution, and I also pointed out that there is a special obligation and necessity in dealing with the Soviet Union produced by the capacity of both of our countries to destroy humanity in a nuclear war." Page 289. The U.S. has joined Britain in some trade sanctions, citing racism after Rhodesia went independent in 1965. The UN did not pass its stringent sanctions until 1978. The Senate itself voted to violate the UN sanctions in order to import chrome from Rhodesia in 1971, with no apparent reaction from the White House, and the Senate reaffirms its position a year later. I must have underlined that because it was a bit of foreign policy I didn't know about. On the same page, 289, somebody wrote, so Wicker said, "The Chilean story is, in sad contrast to Mr. Kissinger's position on Soviet emigration policies." And I don't really know what that means. Page 291. Here are excerpts from the interview recorded by Jan Wenner. The monologue is Ellsberg on Kissinger. He came to Vietnam in 1966 as a consultant to Henry Cabot Lodge. I was very impressed that he took my advice, which I gave to nearly every visitor, but which few of them took, to avoid official briefings and talking to anyone in the presence of his boss or agency head. Instead, seek out people who had been around and talk to the Vietnamese as much as possible. McNamara never did any of these things in all the trips he made, and never seemed to realize how much he was being fooled. Kissinger became appropriately skeptical and pessimistic, and, compared to Walt Rostow or others in Washington, he had a pretty realistic picture of the unlikelihood of much improvement, so that was promising. During 1967, he was expressing a view far in advance of any mainstream political figure, namely, that our only objective in Vietnam should be an assurance of what he called a decent interval before the communists took over, so that we would not be humiliated at home or in our foreign affairs by an abrupt, naked failure. Did you understand that quote? So Ellsberg is saying that he gave Henry Kissinger this advice to ask and prod about the situation in Vietnam and talk to as many Vietnamese people as possible, but only ask people about the situation in Vietnam when they're not in front of their boss. Because if they're in front of their boss, then they're just going to tell you what the boss wants you to hear, which is everything is fine. So Henry Kissinger realized early on that the situation in Vietnam was not good, and Ellsberg was like, oh, this is promising. Finally, someone gets it. This is good that he thinks it's not going to work out, because it's not going to work out, and he finally gets it. And the other part was Henry Kissinger, at that point, his main goal was, yeah, we're going to withdraw, but we're clearly going to lose. Vietnam is clearly going to be taken over by communists, but we should try to save face. Now, this next excerpt is actually my favorite. Out of all the excerpts you've heard, this next quote by Ellsberg is by far the best. Page 292. Ellsberg had been a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense under McNamara. He offered the benefit of his experience to Kissinger, the academic. Henry, there's something I would like to tell you for what it's worth. You've been a consultant for a long time and you've dealt with a great deal of top-secret information. But you're about to receive a whole slew of clearances, maybe 15 or 20 of them higher than top secret. I've had these myself, and I've known people who acquired them, and I have a pretty good sense of what the effects of receiving these clearances are on a person who didn't previously know they even existed, and of reading the information that will now become available to you. First, you will feel like a fool for having studied, written, and talked about these subjects for years without having known of the existence of all this inside information. You will feel like a fool, and it will last for about 2 weeks. Then after you read all this daily intelligence input, estimates, analyses, and so forth, and become used to seeing what amounts to whole libraries of hidden information, you will forget there ever was a time when you didn't have it. And you'll be aware only of the fact that you have it now and others don't, and that all those other people are fools. You will deal with a person who doesn't have those clearances, since you must carefully lie to him about what you know from the point of view of what do you want him to believe and what impression do you want him to walk away with. In effect, how to manipulate him. You'll give up trying to assess what he has to say, and the danger is you'll become something like a moron. You'll become incapable of learning from most people in the world. When Ellsberg had finished, Kissinger said little. He thanked me and said, "It was interesting." I absolutely love this excerpt. It is my favorite quote from the whole book, and the one thing that I always wish to remember from this book. It is so insightful, and it's really set up in a grand scale. We're talking about, Secretary of State and, Deputy whatever, about the Vietnam War. This is very consequential, and yet this applies to everybody's daily life. Okay? If you understood the quote, it was his predecessor. Henry Kissinger gets in charge of the Vietnam War, and his predecessor, Ellsberg, says, "Listen, Henry, soon you're going to be confronted with a ton of information, libraries of information that were top secret. Not even the president knows this information. And you've been an analyst for the Vietnam War for so long. You've appeared on TV. You've talked out of your butt about it. You've written essays and maybe books. I don't know. But now you're going to be in charge. You're not just going to be a critic. You're going to be in charge of it. And you're going to see so much top secret information that you're going to feel like a fool for ever thinking you could even say anything about the Vietnam War. You have written so many books, you're going to feel like a fool that you ever wrote about the Vietnam War without knowing this insider information. And that applies so much with everybody's life. We've all been in sort of a situation of, control or been in charge of something, and outsiders just criticize. And you're like, dude, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know the inside story. You've only heard the outside. And the reason why I really like this quote is because it applies to, there's a very popular video on YouTube, currently available on YouTube, you can check it out, of Steve Jobs. He's doing a Q&A, and somebody asks him a very tough question. You can see it right now. It's basically some guy stands up and he prefaces it, he gets everybody ready. He's like, I'm going to ask a tough question. And everybody jokingly thinks, oh, this is going to be funny, and Steve Jobs does a little funny thing. And then the guy asks, basically tries to humiliate Steve Jobs for being a fool and not knowing what technology to use in the new OS or something like that. And Steve Jobs, it's silent. The room is silent. Nobody talks because it's so awkward. And Steve Jobs takes a moment, and then he talks and says something to if I remember correctly, something to the effect of, well, we're striving to do better. Well, I fantasize in my own headcanon that Steve Jobs should have quoted this book. And he should have said, oh, yeah, well, you think you know better? Well, Henry Kissinger got in charge of Vietnam, and he felt like a fool for, he should have used that quote. And I hope someday I'm able to use this quote. Probably won't. But here's the irony of it. Here's the irony that the whole purpose, if you understood the quote, what Ellsberg was trying to explain to Henry Kissinger, it's the opposite of what I'm saying it's about. The quote is Ellsberg telling him, yeah, you're going to feel like a fool, but don't get drunk with your top secret information, your insider information. You're going to have so much inside information that you're going to feel like everyone else is a fool. And you're going to feel like you can't learn from normal people, laymen. The average Joe, you're going to feel like you can't learn from them, and you're going to become a fool if you do. So don't be arrogant. Have all this insider information in mind, but also learn, keep an open mind and learn from the layperson. And that's, that sort of contradicts what Steve Jobs, what I'm saying Steve Jobs should have done. But anyways, I really like that quote. It continues on page 292. National Security Memorandum 1, a list of Vietnam options for Nixon, went through one more draft, Ellsberg said. At the request of Kissinger, the one option for unilateral withdrawal was deleted. So, evidently, after all that advice that Ellsberg gave Kissinger still didn't learn. Page 293. They had lunch in the compound, Ellsberg and a friend, Kissinger and General Haig. As we all said hello, Kissinger in his usual fashion turned to my friend and said, I have learned more from Dan Ellsberg about bargaining than from any other person. I didn't know what he was referring to, although my academic specialty had been bargaining theory. And suddenly I remembered that 11 years earlier, when I had given a series of talks on the art of coercion, I had also given a couple of those lectures to Kissinger's seminar at Harvard. You have a very good memory, I said, and he replied, they were good lectures. When I rethought that incident later, it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The lectures I had given had to do with Hitler's blackmail of Austria and Czechoslovakia in the late 30s, which had allowed him to take over those countries just by threatening their destruction. One of those lectures was The Theory and Practice of Blackmail, and another one was called The Political Uses of Madness. It continues on the same page. Kissinger asked, do we really have anything to learn from this study? Ellsberg. My heart sank. The major lesson of the study was that each person repeated the same pattern in decision-making and pretty much the same policy as his predecessor. I thought, my God, he's in the same state of mind as all the other makers of decisions, each of whom thought that history had started with his administration and had nothing to learn from earlier ones. I was quite depressed, but I went on to say, well, I certainly do think so. It is 20 years of history and there's a great deal to be learned from it. But after all, he said, we make decisions very differently now. And that capped my depression. Cambodia didn't seem all that different. And he looked uncomfortable and sort of fidgeted in his chair. You must understand, Cambodia was undertaken for very complicated reasons. Henry, there hasn't been a rotten decision in this area for 20 years which was not undertaken for very complicated reasons. And they were usually the same complicated reasons. It continues on page 294. On the wiretaps, the story that Kissinger was concerned with leaks in 1969 is absurd when you look at the people, especially the newsmen who he had tapped. These were people to whom stories were leaked almost entirely by Kissinger. Marvin Kalb, Henry Brandon, Joe Kraft. It continues on the same page. Imagine the ability Kissinger acquired to manipulate those individuals with whom he was working and talking to daily or weekly, when he secretly knew all they were saying to their other sources and associates. Kissinger knew by these wiretap logs whether he was getting through to those guys, what to emphasize, how to change his pitch, how to counter a position credibly and very persuasively, in a way the newsmen could never recognize was based on secret knowledge. And it was precisely those people who were most friendly to him that he had a great desire to be able to control. In fact, the leaks from the FBI indicated that he had asked directly for those taps and that the FBI had insisted on presidential authority for such taps. That was when he turned to the president and got him involved. Page 295. So Kissinger may have been the man who instigated the Plumber program far more than Ehrlichman, Wenner said. Definitely yes, said Ellsberg. Ehrlichman was not involved in initiating those tasks, and the monitoring of them was first done by Haig and Kissinger for the president, with copies to Haldeman, then later directly for Haldeman. And Young, the head plumber, came right from Kissinger's personal staff. Kissinger got into domestic policy more than has yet come out, and he may well have been involved in far more tapping. Another excerpt from the same page. On Watergate. He puts it out to everybody that he wasn't involved. He runs the best public relations operation in this administration and possibly in any administration. It confirms a lot of what I know about media people. A lot of them aspire to be part of the executive branch. Another excerpt from the same page. Kissinger can't be a rebel. He couldn't conceive of taking part in violence directed against authority. But by all evidence, he wants very much to be a party to violence. Ellsberg said, after Cambodia and Laos, I've always privately thought of Henry Kissinger as a murderer. This is page 297, chapter 21, The Survivor 2. Sisko is regarded as somewhat of a yes man, as Kissinger is aware. On one Middle Eastern trip, with the press on board and listening with interest, Kissinger turned to Sisko and said, don't just sit there, Joe. Say yes like you're sitting in a staff meeting. Kissinger respects those who stand up to him, not those who kowtow, a top assistant said. He'll chew over your countervailing idea for a few days, and later you see that he adapts his view to yours. And it says further in the page, he can be brutal in staff meetings if your position is vapid, in his view. It's part of his desire to make people think harder. Page 298. Kissinger quotes Charles de Gaulle. Great men truly build only if they remember that their achievement must be maintained by the less gifted individuals who are likely to follow them. A structure which can be preserved only if there is a great man in each generation is inherently fragile. I wonder if the Constitution falls under that. Also on page 298, a former NSC staffer said Kissinger's brilliance can be attributed mostly to his nearly non-stop schedule. Basically, he works hard. In talking with Faisal, he said he read every letter Faisal and Ibn Saud had sent to a president in the post-war era. And so when the oil embargo was imposed by Saudi Arabia in late 1973, Kissinger was ready to tell King Faisal, you've given us ample warning. Page 299. Another source said that with Kissinger running both state and the NSC, he's ended up sending memos to himself. Page 299. He was granted an informal extension of his leave of absence from Harvard in January of 1971 when Nixon wrote the famous beseeching letter, I cannot imagine what the government would be like without you. Page 300. And before the end of 1973, the Harvard faculty tenure that had eluded him for so long was rescinded again. But now Kissinger could afford the loss. He was Secretary of State. And that's, that's talking about how he never got tenure. He always dreamed of getting tenure. He never got it. Page 301. Now in his 6th year of high-level government service, Kissinger is apparently ready to forget about a remarkably prophetic warning he issued in his book, written in 1962, The Necessity for Choice, to the many intellectuals then serving the new frontier. The intellectual, he wrote, must from time to time return to his library or his laboratory to avoid becoming a bureaucrat who condemns thousands without love and without hatred, simply in pursuance of an abstract duty. Page 303. Immediately after returning from Moscow, Kissinger married Nancy McGinnis, and 1 month later he introduced her to his Middle Eastern territory, Kissinger in Love, while he hammered out the Israel-Syria troop disengagement agreement in a marathon 32-day negotiation. When the agreement was signed on May 31st, it ended the 8-month Yom Kippur War, or the frontline shooting at least, and Kissinger flew home to Washington for a hero's welcome. On the same page, the House Judiciary Committee studying possible impeachment of Nixon had just leaked some explosive FBI files portraying Kissinger for the first time in public as an instigator of the 1969 to 1971 wiretapping of 13 government officials, 7 his own aides, and 4 journalists, 2 his close friends. The documents included a 1973 internal FBI memo to William Ruckelshaus, then the Bureau's acting director, that said, it appears that the project of placing electronic surveillance at the request of the White House had its beginning in a telephone call to Mr. J. Edgar Hoover on May 9, 1969, from Dr. Henry A. Kissinger. Goes on page 304. Kissinger allegedly suggested that Hoover use whatever resource I need to find out who did this. He goes on in the same page. The Ruckelshaus memo said Kissinger told an FBI official after reading the logs of wiretaps on May 20th, 1969, "It is clear that I don't have anybody in my office that I can trust except Colonel Haig." The FBI evidence showed that Haig had ordered 3 taps. Kissinger added that what he was learning from the logs was extremely helpful. Page 306. What finally persuaded Kissinger to accompany Nixon may not be known until his memoirs are written, but one can conjecture about his thoughts during the Monday flight to Salzburg. It continues on the same page. In a wet-eyed rage, his face taut, Kissinger called a full press conference in Salzburg and threatened to resign if he was not cleared. He seemed to feel, as Marilyn Berger of the Washington Post wrote, that he has done much for the nation and is now being treated so shabbily that he is becoming the victim of a kind of witch hunt. Page 307. It soon became clear that Kissinger was not speaking only to Nixon but also to his new constituency, World Opinion, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Page 308. The Times of London put the issue in another popular perspective. His resignation would be far more alarming to the world than that of Nixon. Goes on page 308. Kissinger's appearance at the Ehrlichman trial drew more attention in the courtroom than Ehrlichman's conviction 2 days later. The Secretary of State on the witness stand for 108 seconds was asked just 3 questions. His answers were that he had never authorized and had no knowledge of a psychological profile of Daniel Ellsberg, and that he had no knowledge of any plan to obtain one. At the Kennedy Center in Washington that night, someone asked Kissinger how he had held up through that grueling ordeal. It was very short, he replied tersely. The shortest in history, 108 seconds, someone observed. We'll do it even faster, Kissinger shot back, grinning broadly, now that I've got the hang of it. Page 309. 4 weeks later, on August 6, 1974, the Fulbright Committee issued its unanimous verdict on the guilt or innocence of the Secretary of State. On the charge that Kissinger had participated in domestic political spying and international loyalty checks under the cover of national security, the committee's verdict was the true nature of the wiretaps was outside the scope of the inquiry. On the charge that some of the wiretaps were illegal, the committee's verdict was the inquiry did not inquire into that either, but it is highly unlikely that anyone with Dr. Kissinger's background, largely within the academic world, would question assurances of legality and precedents from the nation's chief law enforcement officers. On the charge that Kissinger initiated and encouraged the wiretaps more than he admits, and that he lived in testimony at his confirmation, and that he lied in testimony at his confirmation hearing about merely having supplied names to be tapped on Nixon's orders, the committee's verdict was, it is a matter of semantics whether supplying a name means initiating a wiretap. Kissinger's role was substantially, quote, as he described it in his testimony last year, end of quote. Page 309. On Wednesday, August 7th, Kissinger said he would not resign. On Thursday, Richard Nixon said he would resign the next day because he had lost his political base in Congress. Kissinger did not offer to lend Nixon his political base. After all, there were no guarantees of what might occur between Thursday and Friday. The prospect of Vice President Gerald Ford becoming an instant president had been chewed over on a daily basis in Washington as far back as mid-March, just before Kissinger took his children to Moscow. Page 310. Indeed, Kissinger had shored up his political base all week by letting it be known that he feared the president's finger on the nuclear trigger. It goes on. To be on the safe side, Kissinger and James Schlesinger took the appropriate steps to ensure that Nixon could not order the missile silos opened on his own initiative. Page 312. This is basically the end. Nelson Rockefeller was nominated for vice president on Tuesday, August 20th, 1974. It happened to be 36 years to the day since a German Jewish teenager named Heinz Kissinger had left Nazi Germany with his parents and his brother and sailed for a new life in a place called Washington Heights in America. Now he was Henry Kissinger welcoming his friend Rockefeller to lunch in the James Monroe room of the State Department, grinning at him and giving Rockefeller a pat on the back, welcoming him to the club. The two men chatted together for a moment while the others watched them. Several observers remarked that Henry and Nelson seemed to have drawn closer than ever after Henry married Nancy McGinnis in the spring, just before the roof began to cave in on Nixon. They remembered that Nancy was a Rockefeller favorite, and they wondered whether Kissinger had put any thought into President Ford's head about who would make the best vice president, Rockefeller or Bush or Laird. The Republican and Democratic leaders of the Senate were at the luncheon, Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania and Montana's Mike Mansfield, and Scott said Kissinger had certainly had an input into the president's choice of Rockefeller. After lunch, the Secretary of State was asked if he indeed had helped choose Rockefeller. Kissinger looked at Rockefeller and grinned, and he said, "You can assume that." So that's it. Those are the excerpts. I hope you enjoyed them. Next, I'm going to make a video about a great, amazing, unbelievable book I read that I mentioned called The Young Hitler I Knew. It's by August Kubizek. It's his rewriting their time in Vienna as kids. So you get to know about Hitler's, as a 16-year-old. It's super interesting. I highly recommend you subscribe so that you're alerted when that comes out. And then after that, I'm going to do a video on a book by Mitek Pemper. He appears slightly in the movie Schindler's List, and the book is called The Road to Rescue, The Untold Story of Schindler's List. It's basically another amazing with amazing tidbits in it, really interesting about the real story of Schindler's List, how more people could have been saved. And you end up walking away thinking that the author of the book was kind of ripped off, like he's the real hero. And Stern, who you like so much in the movie, he comes out as so good. He actually kind of usurped Pemper's role. Great, interesting read. Please subscribe. Thank you, guys.